He thinks this, you know.
Well, good day, everybody. I'm Kyle Curtis. Steve McCraig's joining me, as always. Dave is producing. Welcome to NonSequitur. Hope you guys got some sleep after last night's. I'm not really sure what the word is, but whatever last night was, I hope you got some sleep afterwards. We certainly tried, but I'm telling you, Steve, that was...
I didn't sleep at all last night, but you know what? It wasn't a dumpster fire. People are calling it a dumpster fire, but I got to tell you, even though I made the graphic for the dumpster fire, I don't think it was.
For what it could have been. Yeah, for what it could have been a lot worse. But nonetheless, we are here, and to saying hello to our UK viewers. I get plenty of emails, messages, comments throughout the course of us doing shows, and the UK audience is always saying that we need to do a daytime show so that they don't have to stay up until 3 a.m. So here we are, and we have two lovely people from your side of the pond. And just briefly, the first gentleman I'm going to introduce, he was born and raised in Oxford. Alex J. O'Connor is the owner of the Cosmic Skeptic blog and YouTube channel. He is an atheist, science enthusiast, and advocate for political and educational secularism. Hello, Cosmic Skeptic. It is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to be sort of given the opportunity to defend some of the things that I've been outrageously saying on the internet. So this will be
Absolutely. And also another Alex joining us. This is Dr. Alex Malpass. He's a British atheist who specializes in logic and metaphysics. He is frequently involved in online discussions with apologists, addressing logical, epistemological, and metaphysical concepts, many of which can be found on his blog, Use of Reason. Hello, Dr. Alex Malpass.
Hi, thanks for that introduction. Very nice. Thanks.
Absolutely. It's great to have you both with us. And as always, we're going to run through very briefly what we have coming up. So on your screen, we'll go through the next week of events, beginning with tomorrow. Let me get lined up here. And okay, so tomorrow, Theo Maki will be joining us. That's V is the gentleman's name. He's going to be running through Islam and the creation story and how that affects or eventually will affect Western civilization. That's tomorrow. That's Ideology with KC at 8 p.m. That's Eastern. On Monday, we're going to be talking, Dr. Misha Griffith will be back with us. We're going to be talking about the secret police that the Soviet Union had during the Cold War and the kind of tactics that they used. Is a very interesting story, so join us for that. That is also at 8 p.m. on Monday. And then on Tuesday, Rick Ufrak, the ancient coin guy that everybody loves. I mean, how do you not like Rick? He will be back, and this time we're letting him talk about his favorite subject, Alexander the Great. Many of you guys remember, no matter what coin that we showed on the screen, it eventually led back somehow to Alexander the Great. So we said, you know what? We're just going to let you come in and do your thing with Alexander the Great. So that's Tuesday at 8. And then on Wednesday, this is the get ready, everyone. This guy does not think viruses exist. He thinks they are a hoax. Anything that you see having to do with viruses are either CGI or a hoax so that doctors and Big Pharma can make more money. We have a doctor actually going to be joining us. And can't even speak today, Steve. That's how bad last night messed me up. We have an immunologist tomorrow.
Immunologist.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
An IMU guy.
Yeah, an IMU guy.
Viral guy, yes.
Yes, but they will be joining us to answer the questions that this antiviralist has. So I'm not sure what to expect for that, but should be fun nonetheless. And then finally, we have a debate. Should drugs be decriminalized? That's next Thursday, August the 2nd at 8 p.m. Eastern. So join us for that, won't you? Oh, yes. Thank you, Dave. Adam Kokesh, who is running for president in 2020 for the Libertarian Party. Serious candidate. They say that he's got some promising chances. and he became famous or got notoriety from his anti-war protests when he got back from the Iraq war. So he'll be joining us Friday at 8 p.m. So join us for that. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Steve now. Yeah, we'll do that next time. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to introduce the topic and these fine gentlemen once more, and then we will get to talk about the very simple, very easy to understand, nothing complicated about subject of morality.
Yeah, and I've got to tell you, I've been so looking forward to this topic, this conversation being had for several weeks now. Both of you are two of my favorite people that I've watched for a very long time. Cosmic Skeptic, you have a wonderful channel that I think that you just do a magnificent job, and of course, Dr. Malpass. By the way, we're going to call Dr. Malpass Alex for this conversation, and Alex O'Connor, we're going to call him Cosmic Skeptic or Cosmic just because of the similarity of names, because they're exactly the same. But basically, what brought this about is Cosmic Skeptic had a couple videos on his YouTube channels dealing with objective morality. Again, one of those concepts that is very difficult to wrap your head around for people that are not philosophically minded. But I think that he was doing a very good job to try to present it to people and make somewhat of an argument for his position against objective morality and more realism. So what we wanted to do was kind of bring him to somebody like Alex Malpass and have a conversation between them to discuss his videos, specifically the first and second videos. The first one dealing more with objective morality, and the second one was more, I would say, towards Sam Harris's arguments per se.
Well, I mean, I'd say effectively they were both about objective morality, but the first was in the context of God existing, and the second was it not. But it mainly focused around Sam Harris's version of the argument. But I think the criticisms I made, I like to think, can be extended to all naturalistic morality.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do is, why don't you tell us about your videos, what your argument was, what your positions were about it, kind of the what you've read as far as the criticisms that you've had so far, and what's supporting of your position, and then we can just have Alex jump on in and kind of give a back and forth on that.
Sure. So basically, I figured that in order to make videos which I'd like to make in the future about topics like nihilism and morality and things, I needed to first put out a pretty solid overview of my moral philosophy in general. And so I sort of set out to make a series of videos, let's say, that covered all bases. And so I'm an atheist, meaning that my moral philosophy is built around the assumption of atheism. However, I thought it would be worth also talking briefly about, well, if God did exist, what implications does that have for morality? And the assumption seems to be, for most people, that if God exists, then morality can easily be shown to be objective and can be objective. But I was trying to make the case that I don't think that's necessarily true. So the first video was basically presuming the existence of God. Can morality be objective? And even if it is or isn't, can we know it to be objective or not objective? Can we demonstrate it to be either of those? And then the second video was, well, let's say God does not exist. Let's tackle some moral realism on the assumption that God doesn't exist. And the easiest person to sort of go to was Sam Harris to begin with, because he's made this very strong case that I think a lot of atheists have bought into, which I think is completely flawed for a number of reasons. So those are what the video set out to do. And I've read a few criticisms. There's been a few videos and things. I haven't had much time on my hand, so I haven't been able to watch the really long ones, but the majority of them tend to be more about the first video. And there are some criticisms that I think were fair. And so it's a good opportunity to sort of clear them up. But nothing that I've read has really made me want to necessarily take back anything I've said, even if it would make me want to maybe change the way that I put it originally.
Do you want to give a brief synopsis of like the first video as far as what you think your argument was for objective morality, and then Alex could kind of go from there?
Well, my argument was that there's sort of two folds to the argument, and this is something I think I failed to distinguish, because a lot of people accuse me of mixing up epistemology and ontology when it comes to morality, which I can see why it seems that I did that, because I wasn't particularly clear in distinguishing them, and the first half of the video is fairly confused now that I look at it back. So I like to think of it, and I want to add an annotation to my video that basically says, consider the first part of this video about moral epistemology, and the second about moral ontology. I worded it badly. I confused them when I wrote the original video, but I want to go back and make that annotation. So the gist of the video is basically saying that if God exists, I don't see how that automatically grants the idea that morality can be objective. I mean, that's basically the grid of what I'm saying. And half the video was spent basically saying that even if it was objective, even if morality was objective, you'd have no way of being able to recognize that, and you'd have no way of being able to find out what the actual precepts of that objective morality are. And the second part was basically implying that even if there was a God who could dictate things like good and evil, that still doesn't provide an objective basis for the normative function of shoulds and shouldn't and ought not.
Alex, you want to jump in at that point? This would be a jumping in point, and
Okay.
kind of give your feedback on it.
I took it that sorry, I took it that the claim in the video was that you were arguing that you had, or you was the claim was that you had an argument which to the effect that there couldn't be objective morality, even for religious claims. So you know, even an account of morality that somehow involved God, that wouldn't qualify as an objective morality either, or something. So I guess, given that starting point, what I was thinking was going to happen was the argument was going to be something like this, that you would say, look, on a divine command theory, what really goes on in that theory is that what's good is what God wants to be good. And that means that it's dependent on God's mental states, God's desires. And that makes it subjective. Right? And that's an argument for why religious morality, at least that type of divine command theory cashed out like that, could be considered subjective. But I was confused with what the actual argument was that was saying that religious, because it wasn't that argument, right? So can you just be a bit clearer about what the argument was that I was confused by?
So I don't think it's possible. So this is where the second video comes into play. I think that the criticisms I make of morality there generally, I fail to see how religious belief allows you to escape from those criticisms. So let me think of how to put this most succinctly. I suppose in order for morality to be objective, you would need to provide an objective basis for moral obligation. And I don't think you can do that, because even if you have a God who is all-powerful and the author of all things, the most you can get from that is God determining that you should do certain things, which even if you grant that, which is effectively the basis of most religious morality as I see it, you have no way to objectively base the idea that you should follow God's commands. So
yeah, okay.
You end up with a circle, because if you're going to say that if God exists and God has told you to, that you ought not do this, then that's all very well and good. But I would just ask the question of, well, why should you follow God's commands? And usually the response is something like, well, God is by nature good, and so you should follow his commands. But it ends up being completely circular.
Right. Okay. Good. So this is a more promising argument, it seems to me, which is to say, just because God says that you should do X, it doesn't follow logically from, person Y says you ought to do X, therefore it's objectively true that you ought to do X. Right? That argument's kind of invalid. It doesn't just, someone saying it doesn't make it true. Right? There has to be something more to it than that. And so the question is, well, maybe the suggestion is, well, God's special in some way. It's not just like you saying it. Like, that doesn't confer an ought on me, or something special about God. And what's that special property? Maybe it's that he's the creator of the universe. That doesn't really seem relevant, right? Why does that make it the case that him wanting me to do something means that I ought to do it? And as you say, if it just comes down to, well, it's just the case that God is by definition giver of oughts or something, then it sort of seems like there's no real explanation going on. And that seems like, I think I agree, that type of argument. Somewhere along the line, the divine command theorist has to just sort of stump up and say, look, it just is a fact, right? An irreducible fact that there's some like connection between what God says and what you ought to do. And I can't prove that to you. I'm just saying that that's the case, right? And okay, fine, that can be a primitive of the theory. And then the thought would be, well, a realist on the other side is in exactly the same situation as that. They can just say, look, it just is the case that you ought to do such and such. It's just a primitive fact. Nothing really explains it. It's the same on the God side. Once you clear away all of the stuff surrounding that claim, once you drill right down to it, the theist is going to be committed to saying something like that. It's just an irreducible oughtness that I can't explain why it's connected to somebody saying this to me. Right? So yeah, I mean, I think that seems like a decent argument. But why? So it seems to me that you could just be a moral realist and just say, well, I just think that there are truths like that. Right? So now I'm confused as to why. So we seem to have a fairly good objection to the idea that somebody could just come along and say that you've got an objection, that you've got an obligation, and that we should think that there's anything particularly significant about that. But what I'm saying is that it's kind of a draw between that and the moral realist who just says, I just think there are morally binding facts out there. So have you got an argument that makes us think that you can't have either of these? Because I'm saying that basically they're a draw at this point. They both basically boil down to the same theory. At some point, you just have to have a basic moral fact that's kind of a primitive, and you don't get any further explanation. But do you think you can't have either of those? Is there some reason why you can't have objective moral truths?
Well, yeah, no, I don't think so. So I think that morality consists of two things. It consists of good and bad, but it also consists of ought and ought not, and moral obligation and responsibility. And I think that good is a descriptor, right? Good is a quality that can be granted to a certain thing. And if God is the author of everything, if God is the ultimate determiner, then he can determine certain things as good or bad. I mean, but when it comes to ought doesn't have a noun form like goodness. It's not something that can be a descriptor in the same way. So if God is the creator of everything, then he can create goodness, but there's no concept of creating ought. Ought seems to be a sort of natural follow along from good, but you can't, there's no objective basis for the idea that you ought to do what's good. There's no objective basis for moral obligation.
I mean, look, I think you can have, you could think about this in terms of propositions, right? And things that are true. So, I mean, it could be true, it could be a proposition that, I don't know, helping old ladies across the road is good. Right? It could also be true that you ought to help old ladies across the road. And on that sense, they're not like particularly different from each other. There's just two propositions out there. Right? The mystery is how those two things are related to non-moral things, like that there's an old lady out there or something.
Right.
But I don't see that there's a bigger mystery. I mean, if you say, well, if God says that it's good to help old ladies across the road, I still think I can still question that and go, well, hold on a minute. It being good isn't just determined by somebody's say-so, right? I don't think that you or I can just determine by stipulation what's good and what's not. Right? What's good and what's not is just a fact, like out there independently, like the objectivists will say. So, if you've got an objection to God creating oughts by stipulation, why don't you have an objection to him creating moral values by stipulation? In each case, there seems to be a proposition that he's conjuring into existence by merely speaking it. And that just seems objectionable for the same reason in both cases. So I'm not seeing a real big difference between them.
Well, I do think there's a difference just because, like I say, if the proposition that something is good is true, that has no should. That's dealing just with ises. I mean, think about the Hume's is-ought distinction, which is something I totally subscribe to. It's like you can say the sentence, doing X is good, without getting into the realm of ought. There's no problem. So at least logically speaking, so I think of it this way: if you were to represent morality mathematically, like it doesn't work. So when you're dealing in the realm of ises, you can represent things mathematically. You can say that this is equal to this is not this, but there's no should in mathematics. There's no ought. And so at the very least in principle, when you have the statement that doing X is good, you're only dealing with ises. And so at least in principle, it seems to me possible that could be a true or false statement mathematically, like thinking of it analogously in terms of mathematics. But when you get into saying that you ought to do this, that's not something that can be represented in the same way. There seems to me a distinction between them. You can't represent that in the same way. And so for that reason, I don't think that you can say that that could be true or false. Because whereas, you know, if you follow the line of ises, you can get to a conclusion. But you follow the line of ises all you like, and you never get to an ought or a should. And I think that's what happens as soon as you try to say that there can be such thing as a true proposition that involves a should or an ought.
Okay, so normally the normally the way I think about I mean, it's relatively controversial. I mean, I have philosopher friends who think that this whole way of looking at things is misguided. On the other hand, it's the mainstream view, and it's one that I'm kind of sympathetic to. So let's just run with this, right? That the is-ought gap isn't a gap that has on the one side pure descriptive facts and facts of moral value, and then on the other side has facts about moral oughts. Right? It has moral values and moral oughts on the same side, and then facts about descriptions over on the other. So, for instance, what we're saying is that there are facts that say science can derive. Right? So you can do a physics experiment, or everything in, I don't know, biology is reducible to everything in chemistry, which is reducible to everything in physics. Some story like this, right? Where there's a physical description of the way that the world is, and that doesn't have moral values. It doesn't say what's good and bad. So it can describe, you know, the agonizing pain of a small child or something. But, you know, the physics can't ever explain the goodness, or sorry, the badness of that. Just like they can't explain why you ought not do it. Right? The moral value and the moral oughtness, the obligation, are both things that are supposedly on the other side of the descriptive, normative kind of chasm, like between these two. So when Hume says, you know, if he complains that, you know, you're reading a bit of theology or some of the moralists of his day or something, and they'll be describing stuff, you know, like in utilitarian terms, you know, there's this like accumulation of pain on this side, blah, blah, blah. And a bunch of premises that don't mention any normative terms whatsoever. And then there's all of a sudden there's a conclusion that mentions them. He's lumping goodness and oughtness in together there. He's saying that they don't follow. So you can have a bunch of descriptive premises. God says that you should do this, but it doesn't follow that it's good to do this. Like, it doesn't matter. There's some description about what God says. That's an is. And the conclusion it's good to do that doesn't follow, because what you're doing is introducing a new term which wasn't there in the premises, which is moral goodness. So I think that the way that you're describing it is very different from the way that this situation is normally set up in this kind of is-ought gap.
Okay, so can I make sure I'm sure with what you're saying here is that if you take the is-ought distinction, you're saying that saying something is good or saying that it is bad lies in the ought category rather than the is category.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I don't think that that's fair, because, for instance, the way that you justified putting questions of science in the is category is you say that they're reducible, that they are you know, you can analyze them, you can study them, and you can find the answer. Well, to me, that's not what constitutes putting something in the is category, because just because you have means to find out whether or not the is true or false, that's not what makes it an is. It's like if I were to say 30,000 people were bitten by mosquitoes in the past hour, that would fall into the is category, even though there's no way that we could break that down and actually find that out in practice. Yeah. So in the same way, something being good or bad, I mean, that to me just simply linguistically seems to be an is, and the only distinction between saying something is good and saying something is blue for the moral realist, that is the person who believes that, you know, morality does exist and is a thing, the only difference there is that whilst we have a way to analyze a car and see if it is actually blue, we have no way to analyze something and see if it's good. But just because we have no way to analyze it and no way to know that it's good doesn't mean that it's not good. So I would say that saying something is good still resides in the is category. I mean, by definition, you're saying that X is good. There's no moral imperative there. There's no ought. There's no should.
But I mean, it is true that you ought to help old ladies across the road. Right? There's an is there as well. That's not, you know, any sentence can be stated such as an is. It is the case that you ought to help an old lady across the road. This means the same thing as you ought to help an old lady across the road. But it's got an is in there. That doesn't mean we put it on the is side of the category. That's just a kind of superficial grammatical similarity.
Okay, so what is it to you that justifies moving or putting something, categorizing something in the ought category? I mean, what quality does it need to have to go into that category?
Well, so the idea is that you've got, so the way that Hume thinks about this is that, let's see, something like this, right? You've got descriptions of, let's not worry too much of this. I mean, Hume's a very idiosyncratic philosopher, and the way that he looks at things is extreme empiricism. It's quite bizarre, actually.
Well, I'm more interested in what you think on this rather than.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that the idea between the is-ought gap is supposed to be something like this: that you've got. Well, I mean, I said this already. There's something that the idea is supposed to be that natural sciences. So, like, even if I can't actually derive for you from any set facts that I know how many people were just bitten by mosquitoes or something. Nonetheless, we think that the way that this sort of scientific project works is that there is some relationship between those facts and more fundamental, like, physical facts about, like, arrangements of particles, and then below them some kind of forces and fields in quantum mechanics and stuff. And that those, it is in principle, I mean, I couldn't derive it, maybe no one really could derive it, but, like, in principle, that does explain how many people were just bitten by mosquitoes. There is some kind of weird constellation of of quantum forces that is actually the explanation of what's going on there. But that is completely amoral. There's nothing in that quantum distribution. You won't find any values there. And you don't find any values as you run up that scale more and more towards the fact about how many people are bitten by mosquitoes. Like, there's just no point in that scientific description of what's going on there. You don't find it. And the traditional view is that what's going on is that people look at that situation and project the way that they feel about it. And that's Hume's basic idea. So I feel like it, say, for instance, if I'm watching somebody drowning or something, I'm projecting onto that it's like terrible, and I feel really bad about it. And that's where the moral oughtness or badness or something is supposed to originate. I just feel like I should do something, and I feel like it's bad, but that goes on. But that is kind of in my head, and the description of the way that the world is free of any of those values. Right? It's neither good nor bad in the world itself that thing's happening. That's where the is-ought divide comes down. And then a realist is going to say, well, I still think there's an is-ought. Well, I mean, it depends how realism means lots of different things, right? But I mean, a non-naturalist realist is going to say something like, I think that the goodness or the oughtness resides in the world, right? But it's like not a natural property. It's not. It's a break. It's like the way in substance dualism, where you can have all this explanation of how the brain works and stuff, but then at some point there's just a different thing, which is the mind. Like, they might say something like that. There's all this description of how the world is going, all this like stuff to describe the water surrounding the person drowning and something, and then there's just a different type of property sitting on top of that, which is that it's bad. That thing happening is bad. Right? So they'll still say that it's objectively true that it's bad, and they'll just say that there's a fundamental distinction between descriptive facts about what's happening and these moral values or obligations that sit somehow on top of that. It's a different type of fact. So there seems to be like a coherent story you can tell, which is objectivist.
You seem to be treating as synonymous the idea of good and the idea of ought. I mean, for instance, like you say that you're saying things like in the realm of you get no values. And I have no problem with that, because I don't think that necessarily in the world of good and bad you get values. I don't think that it necessitates value. To say that something is good isn't necessarily to say that you should value it. And in the same sense, I don't think that good and ought are synonymous or can be treated as such, because I don't think that something being good implies necessarily moral obligation. I think this might be where the disagreement lies, is that I would say that good and bad lies on the is side. And because of that, you've got a new distinction now between good and bad and ought not. And so
what's the reason that makes you think that they lie on the same side?
Well, for me, the reason I asked you what constitutes putting something on the ought side is because for me it's fairly simple. The distinction there for me is moral obligation. I mean, that's it. It's like if something incurs the idea that you should do something, then it goes on the ought side, and if it doesn't, then it goes on the is side. I mean, for me it's as simple as that.
So you, okay, I see.
That seems to be what the distinction is getting at. I mean, the whole point of having the is ought distinction is that if you ought to do something, that's clearly different. So ought is about this idea of moral obligation. And so if you have, if you are implying or necessitating moral obligation, it goes on the ought side. If you're not, then it goes on the is side. That's my distinction. I don't know if you have a problem with that.
I mean, it's an idiosyncratic distinction. I mean, just to be aware, the main sort of philosophical tradition doesn't carve it up like that. There's, I mean, so it's that, I mean, you can, of course, it's up to you to kind of logically divide up the distinction however you like. That's fine. I mean, I have no objection to you just saying, I want to think about it like this. That's of course, absolutely up to you. The question would be whether you're carving a significant philosophical distinction doing it that way rather than doing it the other way around. Right? And the reason, I'm suggesting to you that there's a strong metaphysical story about the way that the natural world is, where it doesn't involve moral values or obligation. It doesn't involve moral values. And it's weird for me that you would put them in there, because then it seems like you're just rejecting that whole tradition, that whole scientific project of describing the world in non-moral terms and you know, in non-intentional terms.
Well, I see what you're. I don't mean to interrupt. I see what you're saying, but I think the reason that you're thinking that of me is because of this conflation between good and ought. It's like, just because I'm throwing good in there doesn't mean I'm throwing value in there, doesn't mean I'm throwing moral obligation in there. So I think that you can still have a world of is that has good within it that still does not describe the world in moral terms, because I think that for morality you need both the good and the bad and the moral obligation. And so if you've just got the good and bad, I think you're still analyzing the world in non-moral terms, if you see what I'm saying.
But okay, so I could say my chair is a good chair, right? Because like when I sit on it, it keeps me up. Right? But then I could say of my child, say that he's a good boy because he's like behaving himself, or like sharing his, I don't know, packed lunch with his buddy or something like. And when I'm saying the latter one, I'm meaning not that the thing in question sort of is optimal to the conditions that I'm expecting that something like this, like the chat. What I'm saying is that there's a kind of value attached to the way that he's behaving. I'm ascribing something moral in that case, right? It seems weird to just say, oh no, there's no distinction there. Right? But like, I mean, you describe goodness as if it's not a value. I mean, it's just like functional, like a good chair. Okay, I guess you can have a good chair, and that's not a moral distinction. But we're not talking about that type of good.
You're saying that the reason that this boy is good is because he's acted in line with what he ought to do.
No, not necessarily. There might not be an obligation to share his lunch with his buddy, but it's still good. It's still a morally good thing to do that.
Okay, so you do recognize the distinction then between good and bad and ought not?
Oh yeah, of course. I hadn't ever said that good and ought are the same thing. Right?
Yeah.
The relationship between those things. In the video, you said, I think you made a claim about the relationship, which in the blog post I was saying I disagreed with you, that we ought to do what's good. Right? And that's, I mean, you had another debate the other day. So sorry, you've been debating the same topic a lot. So I don't want to just repeat the same things that I said before. But on that channel, this guy was saying to you that, you know, there's these standard examples of like, there's things like being a doctor is good, kind of morally good. A doctor, that doesn't mean that you're under any obligation to do that. So that shows that those two things are distinct from each other.
See, I see a huge flaw in that in that idea, and this was something I tried to get into when I debated this the other day, but we didn't get down to the surface level, and I realized it probably wasn't worth it for the topic we were on. But we can do it now. So, what my problem with that is, I would to be able to express this problem ultimately, I think I'd need to ask you a question first to clarify something. I'd need to know, what is your justification for, would you admit that there are things that are moral obligations rather than just moral virtue? So where is the line drawn? Like what constitutes a moral obligation versus just a moral virtue? I mean, what is the difference between those two things?
Sure. And I'm not going to say that I have like a watertight way of, I mean, I'm not a moral philosopher, right? Not a specialist in moral philosophy.
Okay.
And I can give you like a mainstream view and I can give you my view. So I do this with that reservation in mind. Like, really an authority in moral philosophy. But here we go. I think that one way you can characterize the relationship between values, moral values, and moral obligations is like this. Let's say something that you ought to do. Right? Like, let's say, take a case that we agree on. Everything else being equal, you just walk along, see somebody drowning in like a river or something. Like, it's not like a stupidly rushing river. You can save them, and you're not going to risk your life. Or blah blah blah. Put away all that crazy context. It's just a normal context. You see someone drowning, you ought to save them. Right? And I think that we can say about that situation, it's good to save them, but it's also bad to not save them. It's morally good to save them. It's morally bad to just walk away. Right? So when you've got an obligation, discharging that obligation is morally good. Withholding from not discharging the moral obligation is morally bad, and vice versa. Right? If you've got it the other way around, and I don't know, you could steal from some blind man's collection pot or something, right? You could, but you ought not do it. Right? It's something you ought not to do. It would be good for refraining from doing that, and it'd be bad if you went along and did it. Right? So that's the relationship between obligations and moral values. So you can see this logical relationship seems quite clear to me.
That's an interesting way of putting it, but so this is helpful, because now I can ask the next question, which is, so let's take something that we don't agree is a moral obligation, or you don't agree is a moral obligation, like becoming a doctor. Let's say it's good, but you're saying that you don't have that moral obligation.
That's right.
And you'd say that that's because it's not bad to not become a doctor.
That's right.
So why is it not bad to not become a doctor?
I mean, so for instance, you could not becoming a doctor might mean becoming a fireman. It's not bad to become a fireman, right? But becoming a fireman is one way of not becoming a doctor. If it was just by definition bad to not become a doctor, it would follow that it was bad to become a fireman. But it's not bad to become a fireman, it's good to become a fireman. You
could envision a situation in which becoming a doctor would be a moral obligation, perhaps. For instance, if you were the last person on earth who could do it, then it would be a moral obligation. So the point that I'm trying to get across here is, it seems to me that the only thing that distinguishes a moral obligation from a moral ought is if there are other moral virtues to consider. So for instance, if it's good to become a doctor, if there was a situation in which, you were no good at anything else, like you wouldn't become a fireman, where it's like you can become a doctor or you cannot, and you can get a job which isn't going to contribute as much to society. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So consider that situation. So you can become a doctor where there's a shortage, like in the UK, we need more doctors. So you've got a choice. You can become a doctor, or you can become, say, an accountant, which is helpful, great job, but it's not like we are dealing with a massive shortage and we've got a big problem, right? Would you say that there is a moral obligation to become a doctor in that situation? I'm assuming you wouldn't.
I mean, I don't think, okay, no, I don't think there's a moral obligation in the UK currently as things stand to become a doctor.
Yeah. Now, see, the only reason why I could see that would be a logical position is because, put it this way, like, we could force this person to become a doctor. I mean, we could force them to do it, and that would contribute more to society than if we didn't. However, we're going to recognize that there's a moral virtue of freedom, and that moral virtue of freedom or liberty outweighs the moral virtue of becoming a doctor. And so for me, there's still a moral obligation as long as it isn't outweighed by another moral obligation, like you ought to respect someone's freedom. So it's not like there isn't this cut and dry distinction. For me, if something is good, then you ought to do it. I still stand by what I said, and your criticism only goes as far as to say, well, let me add a little qualifier there and say, well, if it's good, you ought to do it, unless there's something even more good that outweighs that you also ought to do, then you should go for that, or obviously if it's impossible, then there's no ought either. So it's like, there's still, you can still say that you ought to do that which is good, and you can envision a situation in which something is good but you ought not do it, but only if there's something else that is good and is valued at a higher level, if you see what I'm saying. So there still is this idea that you ought to do what's good.
Okay, so let's on the one hand just remind ourselves of the distinction between meta-ethics and practical ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, goodness, meta-ethics is hard enough, right, without going into practical ethics. I'm very, I'm not, I don't want to say what's exactly specific examples whether somebody's doing the right thing or not. Like, I mean, give me a broad outline of just so I can get the principles in my head, then cool. But, I find it very difficult to say what real life people, what moral obligations are, and I feel uncomfortable saying that. I don't know whether in actual current day England what I should be doing matters. That's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
On the other hand, right, so let's just put practical ethics to bed, because I don't really have anything interesting to say about that. But from a meta-ethical point of view, which is where we started, right, and I can see that there's a close relationship to them, but let's just think about this for a second. That I took it that your claim was a general principle, right? If something is good, then you ought to do that thing, right? Then that's conditional. It's saying, I understood that to be a general rule that's kind of applies across the board, right? So it doesn't matter that there is a circumstance in which it's good to be a doctor and you ought to be a doctor. I agree, there are circumstances like that, but that doesn't. That only supports. That doesn't really help you at all, right? I'm not saying that it's universally false. I'm just simply saying that it's not universally true, and all I need is one counterexample. Right? There are many, right? But
I can't see your counterexample.
Well, the counterexample is it's not a case where there's a shortage of doctors. Right? It's just a normal case, right? Just picture the normal case. There, in that society, it's still good to be a doctor.
Why is it good to be a doctor if there's no shortage?
Being a doctor helps people. It's productive. It's nice. Blah blah blah. So
not if there's not a shortage. This is the point. It's like if it made no difference whether you became a doctor or not, like that if you didn't become a doctor, there'd still be enough doctors to go around and everybody would still get adequate healthcare and be fine. Then surely, why would you still say that it's good to become a doctor? Surely it doesn't matter.
It seems like you're thinking in extremes. In the one case, there's not enough doctors, and in the other case, there's so many doctors that being a doctor means that all you do is sit around never helping people. Right? In a normal circumstance, when there are enough doctors, each doctor is still engaged all the time in helping people. It's still good to do that, right? Just because not doing it doesn't actually mean anyone in particular is going to die. It doesn't mean that you're not helping people. Even if there's enough teachers, it's still good to be a teacher.
I want to be careful here because I like you say, we're sort of slipping into normative ethics. That's not what I'm doing here. What I'm trying to do is get to the heart of this meta-ethical point that you're making, that it's not true that you ought to do what's good in all cases, that's not universal. And I don't think you can give a counterexample to that, because let's envision a world in which there are enough doctors, but we could maybe do with more. It's like you're still left with the situation. If it is good to become a doctor, then why not force somebody to become a doctor? Because there's a higher moral virtue of liberty. Or you could say, well, if they didn't become a doctor, that's not bad because they'd become a fireman. Well, there's no shortage of firemen either. So it's like, which do we need more? Surely that's the better option. It's like, if you could choose between becoming a fireman and a doctor, and it was equal to you, and it didn't matter which one you did, and we needed more firemen than we needed doctors, then is there not a moral obligation to become that fireman?
I think you can cook up situations where there's a moral obligation to become a fireman rather than a doctor, or the other way around.
But I'm trying to say that I don't think you can cook up a situation where it's not the case that you ought to do that which is good. When you consider all of the different types of good that are in play, including the good of personal liberty and the good of being able to choose your own career path, and weighing that up against things like how many doctors there are, these all play important roles. But I don't think you could give me a situation, and like you say, you only need one situation, but we need to get into the specifics, because like you say, if you give me one example in which that it falsifies my claim, then the whole claim's bunk.
Okay, let's do a different one then. It's good to have friends, right? It's good to be, friendship is good. It's a moral good.
Not morally. Why would you say that's a moral good to have friends?
I think that friendship is a moral good. In principle, I think that it's it's hard to express very clearly because it seems so foundational and so straightforward, but
it doesn't seem, I'm not just saying this to be like facetious or argumentative. I genuinely don't see that as a moral good. I see that as like, that's like saying it's good to, I don't know, it's good to play the Xbox because it's fun, it's enjoyable, it brings you like I don't see that as a moral.
Okay, well, let's try, let's see if I can wedge, if we're going to do it like that. Here's a fairly intuitive principle, right? If you ought to do something, then you can do that thing, right? Ought implies can, right? It's not the case that you're under any obligations to do things that are impossible to do.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Although I'd qualify. I'll let you finish, but
Okay, so here's an argument, right? That's the first premise, and it seems relatively uncontroversial. Like most people agree, ought implies can. The idea of an impossible to satisfy obligation just seems wrong in principle. But here's a situation, like let's say you've got, and obviously we can complicate the context, but let's try not just playing the game of complicating the context, because that we can do that with any example. Here's, just take this on its merits, right? You've got a $5 note in your pocket, and there's a dog's charity bucket and a cat charity bucket, right?
Yeah.
You can't, it's good to give to the dog charity bucket, good to give to dog charities, right? It's good to give to cat charities, right? And the general principle, if A is good and B is good, then A and B is good. I think that that's a logical principle too. I think that goodness distributes over conjunctions, right? But then it follows that giving to the cat bucket is good and giving to the dog bucket is good, but you can't, if you rip the $5 note in half, you're not giving either of them anything. You can't give them both, right? So you can't give to both, but it's good to give to both. So it can't be that you ought to give to both, because it's impossible to give to both. And we agreed that ought implies can. But there's no good implies can. That's the difference between ought and good. One of the differences, right? And that's an argument that says that the two things have to be different from each other.
Well, I would answer that in two ways. Firstly, I'd say that I don't know if good does transfer in that way. I think you have to look at actions as being good or bad, perhaps. Like you could say that it's good to give to the cat charity and good to give to the dog charity, but you can't say in any world that if you've got one £5 note and it can only go in one bucket, that it's good to give to both charities. Like that doesn't make any sense. The question becomes, you know, is it good to give to the cat charity over the dog charity? But secondly, like I'd say that if the problem that we're discussing here and have been discussing now at length is this principle that you ought to do that which is good. It's like, I can qualify that if you'd like to say you ought to do that which is good provided it's possible. I have no problem doing that. But the only reason I didn't say that is it's like me saying, you know, oh, if you've got a car, then you can drive us. Like that presupposes that the car is in working order, but you just don't say that. But I'm happy to say, technically speaking, yeah, if you've got a car, you can drive us provided it's working. And I'm happy to say, if something is good, then you ought to do it provided it's possible. That doesn't change my position. So let me add that qualifier on and say you ought to do that which is good provided it's possible. And then my position doesn't change. My position remains the same. But you can no longer use that objection. So the only objection that I think you have is the only way that you could disprove that claim, that you ought to do that which is good according to the moral realist, is find a situation in which there is a good that you there's no sense of moral obligation attached to it.
Okay, I don't think I can prove in any way that, certainly not any more rigorously than that attempt at an argument, right? If you don't think that friendship is a moral good, that's fine. But again, I'm just, or if you don't think that, I mean, so I'm trying to pick examples that are just intuitive, right? I'm just saying, like, it seems obvious that it's friendship is good. I mean, the more friendship in the world, the more goodness that follows from that. That's great, right? But I don't think that there's a moral obligation on people to go and, you know, I don't have to be friends with you, right? There's no two people where it's such that they have to be friends with each other, right? But it would be good if they were friends with each other, right? And it just seems like it's obvious, right? But if you don't feel, I mean, if you say to me, I'll prove that, you know, anyone has to be friends with anyone, I can't prove that to you. But I'm just saying that this is how the concepts work in normal philosophical conversation like this. Yeah. You can pick up that concept. You can use it a different way if you want to. That's fine. But I mean, if you read moral philosophy textbooks, these are the types of examples that are thrown around, not because we can prove with any kind of certainty that friendship is a moral good, just because it's an intuitive everyday concept that people kind of nod along to as a way of getting into the concepts. I mean, I would just have to sit with you long enough to find something where, you don't think being a fireman is good. Okay. Do you think that, I don't know, helping old ladies across the road, is that good? I think it's good. I think it's a good thing to do, generally speaking. I also don't think that I'm under an obligation to do that. Like if I walk past an old lady who needs to cross the road, I don't feel like I'm committing a moral, I'm doing something morally bad, even though it's good if I help her across the road. Right? If you don't share that intuition, I just have to find another example. Like I said, all I need is one. It just seems to be the principal reason why they couldn't do one. All of these seem very intuitive to me.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. Like, I just find the friendship, specifically the friendship example, to be an odd one. I just don't see that as a moral good. But there are plenty of things that we can agree morally, intuitively on. Like, yes, I do think I do intuitively, and I would say subjectively, but that be what that is. Like, I would intuit that it is good to help a lady across the street. It is good to become a doctor in most circumstances. Like, I have no problem with that. But what I'm saying is that if it is good to do something like that, then for the moral realist, for the person who's claiming that morality does exist, as we're arguing that it does, that necessitates the idea that you ought to do that, only unless there is another good which outweighs it. And then
I don't see this. So I can be a moral realist and think that there are moral values attached to things. And I can be a moral realist and think that there are facts that bind me such that I'm under obligations to do certain things. And I don't see that I therefore have to say that that everything that's good is something I'm obliged to do. Like, how does that follow from moral realism?
So, well, let me take one of your examples. So helping a lady across the street is good. Mm-hmm. And so you'd say that that's a moral virtue in that I can't find the right word, but you should do it, not meaning should as in have to, but like it's a moral virtue to do so.
It's good to do so.
Okay, so if it's good to do so, mm-hmm. why not like force someone into a situation in which they do help that lady across the street? I mean, what's the problem with doing that if it's good?
It's a strange question. I mean, like,
yeah, it's. I understand it is an odd question to say, but
it requires more context there, and I'm not sure why we have to do this. Like,
no, but exactly,
there might be a circumstance in which, like, she's rigged up to a doomsday device, and if you don't push her across the road, everybody dies. Right? I don't know. We can always come up with these, but I'm not really sure where you're going with it.
That's not what I'm getting at. It's not so much me trying to find a specific example of something which is good that you yet it's not like you're giving me examples of things that are good and I'm trying to find a way to make it so that you have to therefore do it.
Okay, good.
It's the other way around. I'm trying to get you to give me a situation where something is good and yet there's no obligation to do it without there being some other good that outweighs it. So what I was going to say with the woman across the street, it's like if there were really no downside, like there was nothing whatsoever that would even so much as inconvenience you to help that lady across the street, then I would say that constitutes a moral obligation. In the same way that if there's nothing that would prevent there's no danger that would prevent you from saving a drowning child in a 5-foot swimming pool, that becomes a moral obligation. I'd say that if there were nothing stopping you from helping that lady across the street, then it would be a moral obligation. So what I'm saying is that the only reason that it is not a moral obligation, even though it's good to help that lady, is because there are other factors at play.
Yeah, well, I feel like I know you very helpfully said that what strategy I'm not implying is the I'll find a context where it works strategy, because I mean, hopefully we can both see that it's kind of not helpful here. But it feels to me like actually you are still doing that because, okay, I mean, I guess like I'm walking down the street and I've got literally nothing else going on. So my life is so bereft of other things that there's just nothing competing with my with the idea that I could help this woman cross the road. Yeah, that also sounds like an extreme context. I mean, just forget the extra detail. Just everything else being equal, right? You might be on your way somewhere, but it's not massively important. It's not that you've got nowhere to go to. It's just a normal situation, right? Just forget the context.
Yeah.
It's just a normal situation.
But what I'm saying is that in that situation, in that normal situation, the only reason why that good is no longer an obligation is because there are other goods at play now. It's because in a normal situation, there are things like inconvenience. It's like, if it would inconvenience you and stop traffic for you to get out of your car and help that lady across the street, then that's, you know, that there is a value in keeping traffic moving. There is a value in getting to work on time, and these other goods outweigh the good of helping this lady across the street. And that is the only reason why helping that lady across the street is not a moral obligation. Like, I understand why you think that I'm trying to get technical to make my point work, but I'm trying to get technical to make your point work, and I can't find a way to make it work.
Well, I think actually that you've made my point for me, which is quite helpful. Actually, now I've stopped to think a bit more about what you're saying. So look, you're saying, okay, so there could be a situation where it's good to help an old lady across the road, yet you're not under an obligation to do that. And that's because you're saying, I'm under some other obligation to not help her across the road, or there's some competing good which outweighs that. Like it's more good for me to just keep driving to work and get there on time than it is to stop and help myself.
Yes.
Okay, but that's still a situation where it's good to help the old lady across the road, but I'm not under an obligation to do it.
Yes, but again, you have to look at
proves the principle that you ought to do what's good.
You have to look at the situation holistically. So if you've got a, like, the only reason why, if we're going to agree there that there are other goods that outweigh that good of helping the lady, the only reason you don't help the lady is because there's something else that's good. And unless you have
I grant that. I happily grant that.
But unless you ought to do that good, there's no reason why you shouldn't help the lady. So you're still working on the principle that you ought to do that.
Let's say there's an obligation. Let's say I'm running an ambulance, right? And I've got a dying patient in the back, right? And I'm obliged not to stop, right? It's good to not stop, and I'm obliged to not stop. But also, in some very weak sense, it's good to help old ladies across the road, right?
Yeah.
So I've got an outweighing competing good, alongside which I've got an outweighing competing obligation to keep going and not help the old lady across the road.
Yeah.
Got it. But in that situation, it's good to help the old lady across the road, but I'm not obliged to help her across the road.
But these things don't.
That's a counterexample to your principle.
These things don't exist in isolation. So
but you saying they don't exist in isolation doesn't stop it being a counterexample.
No, it does, because if that, in that situation, let's take that situation precisely, to get out and help the woman necessitates allowing the person in the back of your ambulance to die. And so all of a sudden, helping the woman across the road becomes a bad thing, because it necessitates allowing someone to die. And anything that necessitates a person to unnecessarily die is bad.
Yes, stopping and getting out of the ambulance is bad, right? But helping the old woman across the road, everything else being equal, is good. It's still good.
But everything else isn't equal, because but that's the whole point. You have, if everything else was equal, what that would mean is this super situation that you didn't like me going to, where you have nothing else going on. That's the only time you can say, well, look, all things being equal, which they are, there's no other obligation at play, helping the lady across the road is good. But if you're in a situation where you're driving an ambulance and there's a person in the back of your ambulance, and you have the choice, you can stop and help that lady across the road, that action is a bad action, because it allows somebody to die. You have a moral obligation to do that which is good, and that which is good is to bring the most benefit. So yes, it would bring benefit to help the lady across the road, but it would bring a lot more benefit to help the person in the back of your ambulance. And so because you ought to do that which is good, you stay and help the person in the ambulance. If it weren't the case that you ought to do that which is good, then you could just get out and help the lady, because yes, there's another good in there, but there's no reason that you ought to do it. Like, the point that I'm trying to get across is that the only way that you can escape something being good and having an obligation to do it is if there is another obligation.
Okay, let me recap and see if I've got this right. So we started off by saying, look, helping the old lady across the road is good. On the other hand, here's a situation, right? I'm driving along in an ambulance, and in the back of it is a dying patient. I'm under a strong obligation to get to the hospital and not let this person die, right? So in that situation, it's good for me to keep driving the ambulance, right? So driving to the hospital is something that's strongly morally good, and it's something that I ought to do, right? And then I said, well, because it's good to help the old lady across the road, that counts as a counterexample. And then here's how I understand your response, is that you're saying, well, actually, it isn't good to help the old lady across the road. Actually, it's not a good. It's actually now bad because of this other situation. It feels to me like you've just changed the parameters. We started off by saying, so here's a situation where we agree that it's morally good to do it, right? And there's another moral good which outweighs it, right? But now you're saying, well, actually, because it outweighs it, it doesn't just outweigh it, it turns the first option from being good to being bad. Well, I agree. If there's a situation where you've got a strong moral obligation to go to the ambulance, to get to the hospital on time, and there's a moral good in getting to the hospital on time, and there's something which is obviously morally bad, then it would be morally bad to do that. Like now, helping an old lady across the road is morally bad. Well, if you've changed it so that it's bad, I agree that it would be bad to do it. But let's stick to the original valuation. Like, we agreed to begin with that it's good. It's just not as good as continuing on your way to the hospital.
You can look at it.
You change the situation like that. I mean, I agree. If we change it, then it's not a counterexample. But if we don't change it, then it is a counterexample.
Okay, you can look at it two ways. There are two ways you can look at this. The first is to just say that actually that is the case. It's like, all things being equal, again, I'd say that helping an old lady across the road is good, all things being equal. But as soon as they're not equal, as soon as there are other things at play, you have to do a calculation and work out what is the best course of action. And if there is a good course of action and not doing that course of action is bad, then anything that causes you to not do that course of action is bad. So if you've decided that not following the course of action of driving the ambulance is bad, then helping the old lady across the street, which stops you on that course of action, is bad. Now, yes, that does change the parameters, but the parameter was only set when all things were equal. If you began with the situation and said, you're driving in an ambulance and you have a person in the back and you need to get to the hospital and there's an old lady that needs helping across the street, but if you were to do so, it would prevent that person getting from the hospital. Is it good to help the lady? No. The answer is no. There's no changing of the terms there. But the other way that you can look at this, if you prefer, if you don't like us doing that, is you can just change, again, maybe this is an alteration I need to make, and perhaps I will, especially in the future to avoid this confusion, is rather than saying you ought to do that which is good, you just say you ought to do that which brings about the most goodness. How's that?
Okay, so here's what seems to me a problem with this. Let's take my first original example and change that slightly. So let's say you've got £5 coins in your hand, okay, and there's a dog charity bucket, right? Mm-hmm. It's good to give £1 to the dog charity bucket, right?
Okay.
But it's better to give £2 to the dog charity bucket. But because it's better, if I give 1 and not 2, you're saying that's like getting out of the ambulance, right? There's a better good that I'm not doing, right? Well, so now it becomes bad to give £1 because that means not giving £2.
Only if there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do so.
Right? I mean, it's indifferent to me. I can live equally with £1 or £2 less in my pocket. Right?
Well, I'd say that is bad then, yes. I mean, surely
to give £1 to the dog charity.
Surely it's bad in the sense that, because that to me, if there really is if there's nothing stopping you from giving that £2, if it's like you were going to throw that £2 away, which would have to be the case because otherwise it would bring you some benefit, then yes, it is bad to only give £1 because that's the same as taking away £1 from the dog charity bucket.
So there's two ways of talking about it. One of which would be to say it's good to give £1 and it's better to give 2. And your way of talking about it is that it's good to give 2. Indeed, it's good to give 5 if I've got 5. And it's bad to give 4, 3, 2, or 1. Right? There's only one course of action can be good.
Only in the situation in which there is literally no other reason, no other obligation at play. So, for instance,
where I've got £5 and it doesn't, I make a lot more than £5 a day. Right? It's not going to make any difference to my life if I give 4 or 5. Right?
Well, it's
morally good, and every other course of action is morally bad.
It still makes a minimal difference, although I'd admit to you that I can imagine a situation. So a situation would be like if you had the choice between giving £2 to that dog charity or giving £5 to that dog charity. And if you gave the £2 to the dog charity, the remaining £3 you threw in the river, gone. So it's really just the case that extra £3 is bringing you no benefit and will bring nobody any benefit. And so it is really all things.
I mean, now look,
then it becomes bad. Right?
I'm going to throw it away.
Then it becomes bad, though. Yes.
The throwing away of the £3 is bad, right? But the giving the £2 isn't bad. Giving the £2 is still good. right? But we don't need to think about it like that. Let's just say that I'm going to spend the rest of my money as I normally do, right? In a broad mixture of things about like spending on myself, my friends, giving to charity anyway, blah, blah, blah.
Then that brings you benefit.
Right? But it's still good to give £2 and it's still better to give 3.
No, because that brings you benefit. So no longer is it bad to only give £2 because there's this other moral virtue of your sovereignty and your enjoyment. And it's like, you could weigh that up and say, well, the extra £1 to the dog charity isn't going to make that much of a difference compared to the difference it's going to make by allowing me to, you know, get another drink. Like, this is what I'm saying. It's so complicated. All of these things have to be considered in order to make a judgment. And so all things being considered, like, if it really were the situation where that £3 made no difference to you, like nothing, no difference whatsoever, as in you were going to put it on your shelf and never touch it again for the rest of your life.
That's not the same as it making no difference. That's me wasting it. That's the difference between having literally nothing to do with the rest of the day and having a normal situation where I don't specify what I'm doing the rest of my day.
Whatever you spend that
specific context where I've got literally nothing to do and it's quite extreme and unusual. And putting £3 on the shelf and never using it is quite unusual. But if I just say, you know, it's a normal £3, I don't normally put £3 on the shelf, right? So that's two different situations. You're running together the idea of caterus paribus, where everything else is equal, and an absence of anything, right? Just like a blank void if I don't do anything with that money. Like I tried to say, it's just normal if I just spend it like normal instead of putting it in the dog charity, not throwing it in a river.
But normality has that virtue. It's like whatever you spend that £3 on, whatever it is, no matter how normal it is, that's still bringing you a benefit. That's still a good thing that needs to be considered in the moral calculus. It's like,
okay.
So this is precisely the point that I'm trying to make, is that the only situation in which you could say,
hold on a second. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that £3.
Okay.
So it's not something I can evaluate at the time when I'm putting the money in dog charity. But it doesn't seem beyond my ken to figure out that putting £3 in is better than putting £2 in. But for you, it seems like unless, you know, that's only good if I don't throw it in the river tomorrow or something. Like, I'd have to know that this mitigating circumstance wasn't present. How could I know that? So it makes it seem like you couldn't know moral evaluation at all. Like, it's not relevant, basically, is my point. Look, here's the analogy. Right? I just said there's an old lady who we're going to help across the road, and that's just a good. And here's another good. I'm on my way to the hospital, and I should keep going. And clearly, the good of getting to the hospital on time outweighs the good of helping the old lady across the road. Right? It's still good to help an old lady, but it's not as good as taking the person on their way to the hospital on time. Right? And then I said, so that, you know, I'm obligated to keep going to the hospital. So it's good to help the old lady across the road, but I'm not obligated to help her. And then you said, well, it couldn't really be good in that circumstance. It would actually be bad if you helped her across because of the outweighing good. And I said, hold on a second. Are you saying that any time there's an outweighing good, that turns something that would normally be considered good into being bad? Right? And my example is, it doesn't change the donation you give to charity from being good to being bad just because you could give more to charity. It's still good to give us any amount to charity.
It does, because what's the difference between giving a charity £2 when you could have just as easily given it £5? And I mean, it makes no difference to you whatsoever. And just, and I mean, to me, that's the same as you may as well have just given that charity £5 and then taken £3 away from it. I mean, it's the same mechanism. It's like, there's no reason not to give that £3. And so in the same way, yes, look, if you're driving the ambulance, then helping that lady across the street becomes a bad thing to do. And if you've got a similar situation where you really can give that £5 and it's not going to have any benefit left in your pocket, then yes, it really does become bad to only give 2 instead of the 5.
But look, it feels to me like the consequence of that is that you're going to, so let's take comic relief, right? For our US friends who don't know what that is, I don't know if it's in America, right? Kind of charity fundraising TV program thing once a year, where people phone in and they give money to Pugsy the bear or whatever it is, right? Cliff Richard will be in Africa with some starving children, and phone up and give some money or whatever, right? It seems to me that anytime anyone gives some money that's less than the amount that they could have given, that you're going to say that that's actually morally bad.
No, that's only, again,
Guys are phone up and give half their lunch money to Pugsy the bear to help the poor people. You're going to say, do you know what? You could have given all of your lunch money.
no. Again,
half the lunch money from Pugsy the bear. Right?
absolutely not. No, because again, this is only all things being equal. So in the situation where you're giving up your lunch money, there is a goodness in eating your lunch and being able to afford your lunch. So that goodness of being able to afford your lunch outweighs the goodness of giving that extra amount to charity.
Does it?
It does to you. And if it were not, then you would give that money to charity, because you'd say, well, I'll just go without my lunch, because you consider it better.
But look, what happens is most people who give to these charities actually are not really super rich. They're people who are moderate income, right, of small earnings or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just seems insane to say that what they're doing is bad because they could have given more.
I'm not saying that. Well, this is why I was trying to be so careful to see what you mean by could have spent more, because like if you take someone who's on a low income and it's like, yes, technically, they could have spent more, but not in the sense that it made no difference whatsoever, in the sense that they could have spent some more if they sacrificed something else. But then you're talking about conflicting moral obligations again. So the only situation I would say in which giving less amount does become bad is when it is truly the case where it makes no difference. And that's in the river, because otherwise it does benefit you in some way. So if you've got a poor person who gives £2 to charity, well, they could have given £5 if they went without their lunch, but that's not a situation in which they could have given £5 in the same way that they could have given £2.
Well, look, if they didn't give the £2, they would have had a £5 lunch instead of a £3 lunch. Right? So they went without a £5 lunch by giving the £2. I mean, in each case, there's a sacrifice made. So,
okay, but that's
in one case, look, in one case, giving £2 is good, right? And I'm saying that the force of consequence of what you said a moment ago is that it's bad because you didn't give 5. And now your reason, you're saying, well, no, hold on, because if they gave 5, then they would go without their lunch, right? But I mean, all giving involves a sacrifice. So that can't be what draws the distinction here, because all giving to charity involves a sacrifice. So why doesn't that just mean that, like, giving the £2 is bad? Because it means you're going without a slightly nicer lunch.
But that's precisely why I'm saying that that's not bad. It's not bad to just give £2. Like, it's only bad if there really is no other way, if there really is no other benefit to keeping that money. So if it is the case that somebody doesn't give that £2 at all because they want a good lunch, like, fine, that's not bad, because there's a moral imperative to allow people to feed themselves and their families in a satisfactory way that needs to be taken into consideration. The only situation in which it becomes bad to do something which in another situation could be good is if it really requires. So this is why I needed to use the example of you either give £2 to charity and throw £3 in the river, or you give £5. In that situation, it becomes bad to just give the £2. But the moment that you allow any other wiggle room for that £3 to be used for something else, no matter what it is, now you've got other things that need to be taken into consideration, and you can't just say that giving the £2 is bad anymore. You can say that giving that £3 might be better. It might be even better than giving the £2, but keeping that £3 and spending it on your lunch might be even better than that, especially if you've got a situation where you've given £2 to the charity and you've kept had a good lunch. That maximizes goodness, and so you ought to do it.
So I think let me just try and explain another way of looking at this, which seems to me much simpler than which is that you just say, in the case of, say, the ambulance driving past the woman, it is morally good to help old ladies across the road. And this is an old lady who needs to get across the road, so it's morally good to help her. But it's not as morally good as continuing on to the hospital, right? And in fact, I'm actually under an obligation to continue to the hospital. And as we agreed a moment ago, what's bad is not discharging my obligation, right? It doesn't mean that the helping the old lady across the road becomes bad. That's still good. So I'm just drawing forward the alternative way of thinking about this. Right?
That's fine. If you want to frame it that way, that's absolutely fine. But the only thing, if you want to do that, then I'd have to adapt my premise that you ought to do that which is good, I'd have to just change that to say you ought to do that which maximizes goodness, provided it's possible. That's it.
No, you would. If you see things the way I'm describing, there are goods which are not obligatory, and the old lady case is one of these cases.
Right.
It is good to help old ladies cross the road, and this is an old lady who needs to go across the road, so therefore it's good to help this old lady cross the road. But it's not obligatory.
Yeah.
Because there's this mitigating thing that's going on. I'm in an ambulance, I shouldn't stop, I should keep going. Right?
But that's
all I'm suggesting is that it doesn't stop helping the old lady across the road from being good. We just have to see it, that sometimes there are different types of goods, and there are really good. And here's the way of describing the charity giving. Right? It's very straightforward. You just say it's good to give £2, and it's good to give £3. And actually, it's better, it's more good to give £3 than 2. They're both good. One of them outweighs the other, and the outweighing of one doesn't invalidate the other one from being good. They're both good.
Okay.
Right?
Well,
much more straightforward.
That's fine, but
don't think about it in that way.
But like I say, if you want to frame it that way, then allow me to present my premise in the way that I just presented it, that you ought to do that which maximizes goodness. So now you have a situation where, okay, we'll frame it your way. Driving the ambulance is good. Helping the old lady across the street is still good. But clearly keeping driving the ambulance is better. That maximizes goodness. And so you ought to do that. You know, that's not at odds with the premise. It's like that's fine.
In that example, we stipulated that you're under an obligation to keep driving the ambulance. So I mean, I agree with you that in that case, not helping the old lady is you're obliged to keep going.
Okay.
Right? So there can be something that's good that you're obliged not to do.
But only because you ought to maximize goodness. That's the only reason why that's the case, is because you ought to maximize goodness.
Well, I don't think that maximizing goodness is, because this is the utilitarian maxim, right? And there are awkward cases here. So take bullfighting.
Because I don't think it is the utilitarian case, because I think that whilst the utilitarian case is saying that you should maximize pleasure because that's good, I'm just saying that whatever you take good to mean, you ought to maximize that. I don't think that's the utilitarian case.
Ought to mean, we'll admit to the counterexample that's like the bullfighting case, right? Where unless you say some things are just wrong and you shouldn't do them, like the utilitarian maxim will always allow there to be a situation where, say there's 20 million people tuning in to see the bullfight, and they all ecstatically enjoying it, right? That easily outweighs the suffering of the bull who's being killed, right? On the other hand, you might just say, well, I don't care about that, right? It's just morally wrong for this thing to take place. So that's a counterexample to the utilitarian. It's intuitive utilitarian principle, but you can push it into these circumstances where obviously you think that's a counterexample, right? So it can't be all and end all principle.
No, that's where the difference between what I'm saying and utilitarian comes across, because again, it depends on your conception of good. So as long as you consider going to a bullfight and enjoying it to be morally wrong, then that's fine. There's no contradiction there, because then to maximize goodness, you would just not put on the show and not allow the bull to be hurt, because you maximize goodness.
Assuming that goodness means pleasure, right?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
So the assumption with the bullfighting example is that what goodness means is pleasure. And the idea is that the reason why maximizing pleasure doesn't seem to track closely with what we mean by what's morally good is that there are cases like the bullfighting one where it seems like you can be maximizing pleasure. The pleasure-pain ratio actually does tilt towards pleasure, right? But it still doesn't seem like a case where it's morally good.
I don't think it matters. Like I'm not saying that good is in any way synonymous to pleasure. I'm saying that
that's fair enough.
If you have a moral system, which I intuitively do, I think it's subjective, but I still intuitively have a moral system which says that it is morally wrong to go to a bullfighting ring. It doesn't matter why that's the case, but I think that's morally wrong. Therefore, it's not at odds with my definition of morality that you ought to maximize goodness wherever possible.
Well, what do you mean by maximizing goodness?
Well, if I think that it's good to allow a bull to continue its life, and I also think that it's bad to go to a bullfighting ring, then put that together and you've got a situation where it's undeniably good to not put on that event, or at least it's bad to put on that event, like that's not a problem. So the maximizing goodness is not the same as utilitarianism. It's not, but
Your
because
suggestion was that the relationship between what ought to be the case. So what you're saying, I ought to do the course of action which maximizes goodness, like the best action.
Yeah.
The really best action. Okay.
I hate to interrupt here. We are coming very close to our hour and 30 minutes. We had told Cosmic Skeptic that's how long it would be. Now you guys can continue as long as you want, but I do want to make a time stamp here because we are getting close to that time. And plus we do want to get some Q&A in just for a few minutes if you
cool.
don't still have time, because you know, I obviously this kind of migrated, I think, from the original thing that we were going to talk about, objective morality, and Sam Harris, all the way to moral obligations and duties, which is fine. Fascinating discussion, although I don't see how it related to what we were originally going to talk about, but it was a great discussion. But I've been reading the live chats, and I have some questions for you, for gentlemen, and either one can kind of chime in.
I'm happy to continue. I'll happy to let Alex have the last word. In fact, not as long as that doesn't imply that I agree just by not responding, but I'm happy to let you have the last word. I've actually had an eye just now on the live chat, and I've seen a question that I'd quite like to.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure. If you see
but I'll let, because you were about to say something, Alex. So I'll let you.
Okay, so I think I mean, and obviously having the last word does mean that I win. So.
Well, I may respond.
That's how it works, right? No, I'm kidding.
We'll see how it goes. It depends just how damning.
You're both British. You both win.
Let's see. Okay, so. Well, here's another type of objection to that idea that all that you're obligated to do is what's the maximally good option. I mean, well, one objection to that is how could you know, right? And it seems difficult to. So presumably there's only going to be one course of action which could possibly be the optimal one. And for all I know, putting £5 in the charity means that it's going to some corrupt government somewhere, right? Yeah. And I don't know whether maybe that's actually not the optimal thing to do.
Yeah, but
that just seems another way of doubting that you can really tie those two concepts together.
Is that not also confusing ontology with epistemology? Well, actually, no, I won't accuse you of that. But like, so let's take the moral obligation to save a drowning child from a 5-foot swimming pool. You don't know, maybe that child will grow up to be the person who starts World War III. Like, yeah, okay, fair enough. But if you're going to say that, I have no problem if you want to say there's no moral obligation because of that objection, fair enough. But if you're going to bring up that objection, then you'd have to say, well, technically, you can't really say there's an obligation to save a drowning kid from a swimming pool because you don't know if you know. So I don't see that as a
well,
particular.
Okay, so let this be the answer then, because. So what I'm suggesting is that it is true. It is possible to clearly and easily know. Moral truths in certain circumstances are easy things to know. They're not difficult things to know. And so my point is that any account which makes it impossible to know, that counts against it. And it seems to me that the idea that what you're under obligations, I think it's easy to tell when you're under an obligation in most cases. But I don't think it would be easy to tell what the optimal, the maximal best course of action is. And that makes those two things asymmetrical. How could I, if they're the same, how so then that I can know my obligations when I can't know what's maximum? That's my objection.
Well, because the obligation that you know, that you intuit might be wrong. I mean, that obligation might be the wrong obligation. You might not actually have that obligation.
Well, I mean, in the way that if I'm looking at a drowning child and I think that I'm under an obligation to do that, I feel like, I guess in a kind of ultra skeptical sense, I might be wrong about that. But it seems like a commonplace, everyday type of knowledge, right? Whereas if I'm looking at the child and I'm thinking, well, is it the maximal course of action, right? It's not just common day, it's not just like ultra skepticism that might make me doubt that. It feels like I just couldn't know that, right? How could you know that?
It must be the case that
epistemically asymmetric for them.
Again, remember that when I'm talking about morality, this definition of saying that you ought to do that, which is good, I don't believe in concepts like good and ought and bad. I think they're nonsense. So I'm sort of working on the other person's parameter here. So, like, when you've got, let me think about this. Your objection is that it seems sort of commonsensical to help that child. Well, have you noticed that the way that we've framed this moral obligation is we haven't just said there's a child drowning in the river. It's like we have to say, that river's not going to harm you. There's no danger to you, because as soon as you introduce these other factors, it's no longer a moral obligation. Well, when you think that you're maximizing goodness, because you intuitively feel that helping that child will maximize goodness. If it were the case that there were some danger to you for saving that child, then the reason that no longer becomes an obligation is because you intuitively feel that you are no longer necessarily maximizing goodness. Because if you both drown, then that has the opposite effect. So I still think that even if you've gotten it wrong, and this is why I think it's not a problem for me, because I think that everybody's got this wrong, because there's no such thing as...
No. That's a case where it's obviously not maximizing.
But even where it's not obvious, you might have it wrong.
Here's
Like,
a case where it's not obvious.
No problem with that.
What that kid's going to do in 40 years.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I can't know now. But it doesn't seem like that stops me knowing whether I'm under an obligation to save him.
Well, I think technically, I suppose it does if you're thinking it through, but if you're going to say that, well, it doesn't because I still have that intuitive sense of obligation, that's fine, but you should just recognize that obligation might be wrong. And if you're a moral realist, the idea is that things like moral obligations are true and false. They exist. And so if there's a chance that you've gotten it wrong, then I could throw the same criticism back at you. It's like, well, what if you've got your moral obligation wrong? Like, what if you get maximizing happiness wrong? Fair enough. But what if there's no way to know what your moral obligation is?
Okay, and we do. I do understand that we've carried on even after we've said that we're going to stop. But
yeah,
it's like saying, look, that I could identify someone I know walking towards me on the street, right? And as you say you come walking towards me, right?
Sure.
And at a certain distance, I can't recognize you. As you come closer, you become clearer to recognize, right? And I've seen your face plenty of times before. So at some point, I say, oh, it's Alex, right? I feel like I can recognize you, right? Now, I could be wrong about that, right? It's a commonplace, everyday thing. It's the sort of thing that I do all the time, right? And this is the same. That's what I'm saying is, on lots of cases, identifying moral obligations is as commonplace as that, right? But now what you're doing is you're equating it with a quite different situation, which is the being able to evaluate the perfect, maximally good situation. And that is more like solving a long equation or something. Like, I am much less clear about how to do that, if I can at all. And and then you're saying, well, but in both cases you could be wrong. But that's true. But to say that that's in the same way is just to string together two things that
okay.
Like, they're both things that I could be wrong about. But one is one that I'm much more sure about, and much less likely to be wrong, even though that's why it's asymmetric.
But I mean, remember that we're speaking meta-ethically here. So like in the situation in which you could work it out, in the situation in which you could know what maximizes goodness, there'd be no controversy around saying that that's what you ought to do. Like yes, it's a fair objection to say that practically speaking, we might not be able to do that, but meta-ethically, if you can know what maximizes goodness, that's what you ought to do. I mean, that's the meta-ethical position. It's like you ought to do that which maximizes goodness. Remember that the premise was this: you ought to do that which maximizes goodness, provided it's possible, right? And I would include under things being possible, not just things like, well, you can't give to two charities at once. That's a logical impossibility. But I'd also include under that impossibility things like not being able to work out, but not being able to possibly work out what that maximal goodness is. That qualifies it as impossible, so I still think the premise kind of stands, but I get your objection. Like, it's a fair objection. It doesn't necessarily work practically, but I say that meta-ethically, that's what it comes down to. And I suppose what I'll do based on this, and maybe this is a good place to end unless you have any severe objections, is I will amend my premise there, or my definition of morality, let's say, so that rather than just saying, the idea that you ought to do that which is good, the idea that you ought to maximize goodness, provided that it's possible, and including in that possibility is the possibility to actually know what is the maximal goodness. I think that works, but I'll have to make that amendment at some point.
Okay. So was that your kind of your closers there?
Call that my.
I don't want to keep you guys too long. I know you guys are in England. It gets late, but I'd love to have some questions if we can get some knocked out, maybe. Okay.
I'm happy to if Alex is.
I'm happy to. I was trying to mute there so that Alex could have the last word. I was trying to be gentleman. Okay.
Very, very good. I don't know if you could read the inside chat. Could you, Cosmic? Because
the which chat?
the group chat.
Oh, what the one that we've got on here?
Yeah.
I had it on a different page, so I haven't seen it.
No worries. I was kind of just typing some thoughts.
Oh yeah, sorry. I would have responded, but I wouldn't have been focused anyway.
But what? So let me ask you gentlemen this, because I think since we've moved into moral duties and obligations, for your argument, Cosmic, you're saying, from what I saw in your video, that a moral duty is attached to when you have a situation where you have a good that you think that can be maximized, as you say, right? And the way I read what Alex Malpass's blog was as a defeater for this was his example with the dogs and cats. So you have a £5 note. It's morally good to give to charity. It's morally good to give to a charity for dogs, and morally good to give to a charity of cats. But you have one note, and you can't obviously take that note and split it in half. So so for something to be obligatory, must also be possible as well. So if they're both morally good, right, but not possible, then how does it follow that a morally good must result in a moral obligation or duty?
Because I would say that, again, you have to look at the situation holistically. These two charities don't exist in isolation. It's like it can't be. So there are two ways of looking at it. Again, earlier when we were talking about the idea, is it bad to not help to help the lady across the street? Like, if you want to frame the discussion that way, then you could say, well, it can't be good to give to both charities if that's not possible. But also, if you look at it holistically, you could rephrase it to say something like, well, it is good to give to one of those charities. And if there really is no difference between them, so let's say that if there's some imperative to give to one over the other, then you could say that it's because it's better to give to that charity, you should do that because you ought to do that which is maximally good. However, if it were really the case where there was genuinely no difference and it was completely equal, then the flip of a coin and recognizing that to maximize goodness in this situation, the only thing you can do is give to a charity, because of course giving to one charity prevents you from giving to another, but that doesn't outweigh giving to that first charity, because the goodness of giving to that charity outweighs the badness of not giving to either charity. So you're still maximizing goodness by randomly giving to one of them. And if it's not random, if there really is no complete equality, if there's even a hunch as to which is better than the other, then because it's better to give to one than to give to none, then you should give the money to that one. I don't know if that answers your question, but again, remember the amended premise is now you ought to maximize goodness so long as it's possible. And so if it's not possible to give to both charities at the same time, then that doesn't come into it.
Alex, do you want to take that? Because he did amend that, and so that kind of changes the initial conditions. But I always take things Sarah preparedness where your initial conditions are such, and I just noticed throughout the discussion, every time there's a initial condition, something changes as a factors, and I'm wondering.
Well, it's an interesting thing to consider. Does something become bad if it was originally good, but now doing it prevents you from doing something better? I mean, that's an interesting discussion. And to be honest, you're just going to have to make that decision for yourself. Do you consider that to now be bad? And if you don't, then you still have the situation where you've got something that's better than something that's good. And so if, for instance, it would be better to give to one charity than to try and give to both, if you know what I mean. Like, even if you don't think that that's a bad thing to do, even if you still think it's good to try somehow to rip the note in half and give it to both, because at least you're doing something, like, it's still better to just give to one of them. So I mean, that's I don't see that as a problem.
Did you want to add anything to that, Alex?
I mean, we did talk about that quite a lot. I think. Yeah. I mean, a slightly more general point, the strategy of so there were two strategies on display in some ways here, and as you said, a lot of this came down to what we mean by our cateris paribus clauses and the idea of specifying a morally relevant situation, right? And I mean, when it comes to ethics, I'm a fairly straightforward kind of person, the way that I think about these things. And I'm not convinced that moral principles can't be stated without a never-ending search for explicitly stating all of the conditions in play. I think that you can state fairly straightforward moral principles without needing to endlessly chase down, but what if this, but what if that? I think that those types of I think that stalemates the conversation quite quickly, but I'm not sure that it helps either party to do that. And
so you're saying there's some basal propositions that you don't need to sit there and wonder about an infinite amount of variations to them.
Kind of. I mean, I just think that like you can say things like taking pleasure in another person's pain is wrong. And I mean, like, yeah, if that person, when I brought this up before, but like, obviously, yes, what if that person's like hooked up to a doomsday device, and if he doesn't take pleasure in that one person's pain, everybody in the whole world dies and gets tortured for infinity or something? Like, yeah, obviously in that context. So, I mean, yes, I'm saying that there are contexts in which any of these simple and mundane moral statements that I'm saying can be overturned, yet I don't think that that on its own means that you can't make these. It just sort of changes the subject to say that. So we can just say, look, if these are not, I once worked for a stop smoking charity, right? And we had to talk to people about like the benefits of giving up smoking. And I remember this woman said to me something like, oh yeah, well, you say it will make me healthier and blah, blah, blah. Thing is, what if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? And it's just like, yeah, okay, let's think about a situation where you don't get hit by a bus tomorrow, right? Like, that's the normal one. I mean, obviously, yeah, if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, then, smoke as much as you like today, but let's just make the general principle.
Yeah.
So you think there's some kind of moral primitives then?
Yeah.
In that case?
Yeah.
Okay.
But look, I don't necessarily disagree with that in the sense that in every situation, I admit that it's not necessarily possible to fully calculate and consider every possibility that considers, is this thing really better than this? What I'm saying is that allows me to get out of the situation where I can admit that all things being equal, it does become bad to do something that was once good. But I think that if you've got a problem with me doing that, then you say, well, hold on, because does it really become bad to give £2 instead of £5? Well, I'm saying, well, when you do get into this technical, annoying and pedantic conversation about the technicalities of a situation, that can allow in any situation you to escape the situation of having to say that giving £2 to charity is bad. But I agree with you that if we're just talking in terms of one thing is good, one thing is better, how can we work out which is actually better? Like, you're right, there are certain times where you just have to either trust your intuition, or there are times when it's just blatantly obvious. But in such situations, you wouldn't be able to assertively say that the lesser good is therefore bad. You wouldn't be able to say that with any kind of assertiveness. But I mean, you're right.
Yes, for me, it just seems like that's if we're comparing strategies here, it seems like that the intricacy and the speed with which the context subsumes your ability to make a declaration about what's good or bad feels to me like it counts against your way of talking about it. Well, and I'm not really sure I saw the benefit in doing that, because all I was suggesting was that you just concede that there are some things that are good that you're not under an obligation to do. And I'm not really sure why there's any resistance to that.
I still...
What you did was you bit a bullet, which was very drastic, by saying, well, okay, in some circumstances, to some extent, you can't really properly evaluate what's good or what's bad, because all this context needs to be spinning around in the description before you can really give any kind of understanding of what's good or bad. I mean, it just feels like I feel like you've wandered off into the area where ethics is so difficult to say anything, just to avoid saying, actually, yeah, there's some things are good and not obligatory. And I'm just not sure why you want to pay that price. Like, theoretically, I don't understand what you get for making that move.
Well, there are two things to answer that. The first is to say that, I mean, you may be right. You may be right that the meta-ethics that I'm putting forward makes things very difficult in practice. But again, we need to draw a distinction between practical ethics and meta-ethics, like you wanted to earlier. It's like, if the practical ethics becomes difficult, like, so be it. That doesn't discount the meta-ethics. I mean, you can't say that because practically this meta-ethical theory is difficult to use or is too technical or pedantic or take too long. That doesn't mean that the meta-ethical underlying is wrong.
It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it does mean that it's difficult to see what the benefit is. You're getting a lot of obvious problematic. It's difficult to even say anything moral. That's obviously a con. And it seemed to me that the only benefit that you got was that you were able to deny the seemingly intuitive principle.
Yeah, but do you see? So this is how I've gotten to my conclusion. It's like you're saying that the problem with the meta-ethical theory is that it kind of nullifies ethics in a way, because it makes it too difficult and impossible to really know and get to grips with. Well, precisely my point. It's like, whereas you seem to be putting the conclusion there first and saying, well, you know, I don't like the idea that ethics should become too confusing, and so, you know, let's reject the meta-ethical principle. I'm starting with the premise and saying, well, I have this meta-ethical theory that I agree with, and that's led me to the situation where ethics is pretty unintelligible. My conclusion is, therefore, ethics is unintelligible. Like, so be it. Tough luck, you know?
So some kind of ethical nihilism?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I'm absolutely an ethical nihilist. Like I don't think that the statement X is morally right, or you ought to do. I'd rather phrase it like this: that the phrase "you ought to do X," I don't think that can be objectively true or false. It's not like I don't know. It's one or the other, and we can never know if it's true or false. It's like it can be neither. You know, that's my position on it.
Wait. So it's not a question of context, right? It's not just that it's so difficult. You can't so what I was thinking was you were kind of contextualist at saying, look, there's too much in the context that needs to be specified. That means that saying whether or not something is good or bad is practically, you know, for all practical purposes, it's impossible for me to do. Right? But a nihilist is someone who's saying there is no truth about
bear in mind, the whole of the conversation we've been having has been under kind of the pretense of good and ought being you know, being concepts that make sense. So it's like, let me put it this way: I'm an ethical nihilist because I don't think that good and bad make any sense. But this whole conversation has been, even if we do allow for concepts like good and bad and ought and ought not, even if we allow for that, like I'll say, okay, well, let's say that those concepts are, you know, do have meaning. And it's like, then you run into all these other problems. So you still can't get off the ground.
If I was someone who didn't believe there were any ethical truths, right, mm-hmm. and then I said, well, okay, let's play the ethical game, right? Then I wouldn't really quibble about what the basic principles were. I mean, if I didn't believe there was any such thing as good or ought, and you know, say we were switched our roles, right? And you were saying, hey, there's some things that are good and they're not obligatory. And I'm an error theorist, and I'm saying, well, there's nothing's good and nothing's obligatory, but I'll play your game for you. Why would I insist on denying that premise? I would just say, okay, how do you want to play it? Like, I mean, I don't believe any of that's true, but let's just see how coherent it is.
Well, remember, so for instance,
I'm confused.
For instance, the video that you responded to on your website originally was the video saying that if God exists, morality still can't be objective. Like, I don't think God exists, but I'm entertaining the idea. Like, I'm working on your terms. Like, when I define morality, that's not what I don't think that you ought to do that which maximizes goodness, because I don't think those concepts make sense. What I'm saying is that when other people talk about morality, that's what they mean. And so I'm sort of working with what they're saying, if you see what I'm saying. So like,
take a step back and just say,
yeah,
neither of us is advocating either of these positions, right? But just look at the relative merits and dismerits of each of them, right? Because you don't think either of them is true, so it doesn't. You're not committed to either of them, right?
Well,
one theory,
not objectively. Not objectively. I can still recognize that, like, I can still say that something is morally good or bad, or that something is better than the other, as long as I'm not making that as an objective claim.
Well, but that's not what nihilism means, though.
Yeah.
Well, well, I mean, how would you define ethical nihilism?
Well, it's essentially error theory. You're just saying there's no moral truth.
I'm an ethical nihilist as well.
Yeah,
I at least tend to go to error theory. I find it interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I'd call myself an error theorist. Like, I don't see a contradiction between saying that there is no true or false answer, like objectively, to a moral question, but also allowing for subjective intuition. It's
well, an error theorist would say that they're all false.
Well, right? I'm not saying they're all false. That's why I'm not an error theorist, because I'm just because I say that they're not true doesn't mean that I say that they're false. I'm saying they're neither, objectively speaking. But
okay, so you're saying there's no moral truths.
There's no objective moral truths, yeah.
Okay, and then when you talk about, and you say, so this position is something like, I don't know, maybe quasi-realism or something, intersubjectivity.
Yeah, sure.
We agree with one another that helping old ladies across the road is good, and that agreement is basically just, that's all, it's a fiction that we both like play along with, and so long as we both play along with it, we can run institutions like law and order and police and blah 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 and justice, and we can pretend and make believe and blah blah blah. Like that's the view.
So it's almost like fictionalism in a way.
Well, I'll put it this way. I've used this analogy before. So, if everybody agreed that blue were the best color, subjectively just thought that blue was the best, then I can say things like, well, if you're going to get a car, you should get a blue car, or you should paint your walls blue. Like you can still kind of, you can make that work, and it's difficult to distinguish that from objectivity. It's like you can treat it as though it's objective almost.
Okay, so
like, it's still subjective.
Distinguishing those two things from one another. On the intersubjective agreement view, where everybody just agrees that helping old ladies across the road is something is good, and they all agree that keeping on going to the hospital or whatever is something that you should do, blah, blah, blah. We all agree on these. Well, now let's just stipulate that we find another culture that thinks differently about it. Right now, the intersubjective viewpoint now looks exactly the same as just straightforward subjectivism, where you've got two people who happen to disagree with each other.
No,
right?
No.
The difference is, well, the similarity between those two cases is from the perspective of one culture, you all agree with each other, but you don't all agree with the other culture. And
Well,
there's nothing
cultural subjectivism.
Yeah, no, I am.
And that makes it different from objectivism, where one of them is wrong.
I'm absolutely not a moral subjectivist in that sense. And I can actually answer that objection. It's like the agreement that I'm talking about, the agreement that blue is the best color, is not the surface level moral agreement. It's more the kind of agreement that someone like Sam Harris talks about when it comes to pain being bad. So like, even if I disagree with another culture about something being good or bad, there will be some subjective agreement that we do have. And as long as I can make a link between the thing that we're trying to consider, if it's moral or not, and that thing that we agree on, then I can use words like should and ought and is. So let me give you an example.
Okay.
I can get just so that this is illustrated better. So let's take a situation. I've given this example a few times before of me speaking to a Nazi. Now that Nazi thinks that the Holocaust was good. I think that the Holocaust was bad. Now, the moral subjectivist might say, well, there are no, there's no underlying moral truth. It's just, for me, the Holocaust really was good, and for him, the Holocaust really was bad. I'm not granting that. I'm still granting that morality is subjective. What I'm saying is, this is where it gets similar to what Sam Harris says, which is something like, if we can both subjectively agree that living in an orderly society, let's say, is a good thing, and that's purely subjective, we just like that fact, we just like that we think that that's good, then the question is no longer, is the Holocaust good? The question is now, is the Holocaust conducive to an orderly running society? And if I can show that the Holocaust is not conducive to a smoothly running society, and the Nazi subjectively thinks that anything that's not conducive to an orderly running society, or has the opposite effect, is bad, then I can demonstrate to that Nazi that the Holocaust is bad, not by referencing some moral fact, but by referencing their own subjective hunches. It's like, I'm not going to say you're wrong objectively. I'm going to say you're being inconsistent.
Okay, so it seems very implausible to me that that would ever really happen as a conversation. I mean, and I don't want to just stray from the principal point into a matter of particulars, because that's exactly what I was arguing against as your strategy a moment ago. But I mean, the Nazis not going to really concede anything like that. Like, they're going to say that a well-functioning society is one that's racially pure.
Yeah, but I can say that they're wrong. I can say that they've gotten that wrong, not with reference to a moral fact, but with reference to their own subjective hunches, to their own subjective recognition.
Because they're subjective, that their baseline level of value requires the purification of the nation or whatever.
No, because you ask, why do you value that?
Sure, so he already values that. That's right. So you can't talk him out of it.
But you ask, but even if I can't talk them out of it, it doesn't mean that I can't still think they're wrong. Again, that's the difference between.
You think that they're wrong. Subjectively, in your perspective, they're wrong. But you were suggesting that you would be able to make him see that it's wrong.
Well, I would be able to say that person is wrong, even in accordance with their own subjective beliefs. They might not accept that. They might kind of disregard that, but I still think that that's possible. So like, you might say that the baseline belief is a belief in racial superiority, let's say. Well, you just have to ask the question, why do you think that's the case? And when you break it down, when you break down any moral value, you end up getting somewhere that you can agree on.
I don't think that that's necessarily true. I mean, I don't understand why that. Okay, so I mean, let's just paint a picture of a guy.
Sure.
He just says, I mean, it's distasteful to have it as an example, but let's just say, okay, he's like committed to some race X being racially pure, right? He doesn't live race Y in his community, and he thinks they should be exterminated, right? And then you're going to say, yeah, but don't you like well-functioning society? And he's going to go, yeah, and the well-functioning society is one that doesn't have any race wise in it. And you're going to say, yeah, but what about their suffering? And he's going to say, yeah, but screw them, you know, it's not as important as race X's prosperity. And every time you think you're finding common ground with him, he's just going to dodge it. Now, the charge is that he's going to be inconsistent. And that seems wildly, I just don't see how he could possibly, I mean, prove it, right? Prove it.
Yeah, I know, but that's what I'm saying. I can show that he's being inconsistent, even if he doesn't concede that. So let's say, you know, this person believes in racial superiority of the race X. I'd ask, why do you value that race as superior? I mean, what's that based upon? So
he says that's just the ground level basis. Like, why do you value, I don't know, pleasure over pain? Right. At some point, we're all going to have a fundamental starting point in our moral system.
This is
mine. So you know,
this is where I think Sam Harris is. This is where I think Sam Harris is good, because as long as he's willing to admit that the basic assumption he's making is subjective, I agree with him. But he doesn't do that, so I disagree. But let's say that he does. Like, if you need to break it down far enough, you can break it down to such a basic level as something like, we can say that subjectively, the worst possible misery for everybody is bad. And as long as you can grant that, you can start making gradations. You can say that we all experience pain as bad. And as long as you can link things, as long as you can link the top level moral discussion to these subjective underlying agreements, you've got no problem.
But he would just have a completely different classification. He'll say, look, it's not, all that's bad is the overall pain and suffering of race X. Everything else doesn't matter. Right?
Why? Yeah, okay, but even granting that, like, if I can say that, you know, by having this vision of racial superiority, that actually harms your well-being, ultimately.
Why? Why should he accept that?
Well, he might not accept it, but that doesn't mean it's not true. You know,
you were saying that you would be able to get him to see that it was true.
Well, maybe I misspoke. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying that. So I'm trying to get myself out of the claim of moral subjectivism. So I can say myself that I don't believe that because you subjectively think that, you know, this is good, and I subjectively think that something to the contrary is good, that we just both have to be right. Like I can still think you're wrong. Now, I might not be able to convince you of that. I might not be able to convince him of that. But I myself would still think that person's being wrong. And you're right. Maybe I did misspeak, because I tend to phrase it as, you know, I could convince him that he's wrong. Maybe I couldn't. Maybe I couldn't convince him that he's wrong.
If you were both self-conscious subjectivists, neither of you would think that the other one was wrong, right? Because you would both think that all you were doing was stating your own beliefs. So
yeah.
It wouldn't even be a question of I can persuade him that he's wrong. It wouldn't even seem to you that from his.
Yeah, but that's why I don't subscribe to that moral theory.
So you don't subscribe to. So I'm confused. I thought.
Oh no! I hope this hasn't been a big misunderstanding.
What position do you hold? Because I thought the same thing. Because from that perspective, an individual would just say, I subjectively believe this, and that person subjectively is bad. But I have no higher moral high ground to explain to them why they're wrong. Correct?
No, so I don't.
Subjective to myself.
This is what I was saying a moment ago when I say that if a Nazi thinks that the Holocaust is good and I think that the Holocaust is bad, I am not. My ethical theory is not to say, well, I guess that's just a disagreement.
What is your meta-ethical theory? Because I mean, we keep going from normative, now we're back to meta-ethical, and kind of going back and forth.
The ethical theory is to say, well, I still think that if you broke down that person's if you broke down why that person believes that thing, so for instance, that the Holocaust is morally good, if you were to break that down far enough, I believe that the subjective notions that you found hidden at the very basis, even if they didn't recognize them, even if they are ignorant of what those subjective underlying notions really are, I think that if you broke that down far enough, you would find that that base notion is actually in contradiction to the top level. And if it weren't, if it really were that your underlying subjective basis for the things that you believe morally is completely congruous with the thing at the top, then the thing at the top probably is moral, in the sense that if we can all agree with that subjective basis and we can link that top level moral proposition to that subjective basis that we all agree on, then we have no reason to say that that is immoral. Like, we can't say that that's immoral. If we all agree on this subjective basis, we all agree that this is good, and we've shown that doing this brings about this, we have to say that doing this is good subjectively, but we can all agree on that. So it's not moral subjectivism in the sense that you're putting it across.
I mean,
maybe I'm not expressing myself very well here. But
there's various things about that just seem very strange to me, right? Like I don't think Harris's idea that there is universal agreement on base level moral values is particularly plausible. And
is that a quasi-realism type position, Alex, of some sort?
No.
Then what is the intersubjective? What position would be something that is intersubjective, where there's a community that says this is what we accept to be a moral good?
Interest rates, right? Interest rates are intersubjectively objective, right? If everybody died tomorrow, there'd be no interest rates anymore, right? The value of money requires people to believe that it has that. But on the same time, it's not just up to me personally what the value of the pound is, right? It's a product of our collective agreement.
That still falls under moral.
No, that's exactly the same as morality. That's precisely my view of morality. If everybody died tomorrow, there would be no morality. Yes. Morality requires human minds.
But that's it. That's your intersubjective view.
But if someone came to me tomorrow and said that, I just think that £1 is worth $2, I could say, no, you're wrong.
Yeah,
even though ultimately it's not an objective basis. So that's a perfect example. That well sums it up, actually.
Yes, right, exactly. So that's the intersubjective viewpoint. But the problem with that view, as I outlined a moment ago, is that if you so let's just rewind a second. Say, just take bog standard subjectivism, right? Where when somebody says this is wrong, right? Murder is wrong. What that means is I don't like murder, right? And so it's just a description of their own beliefs. Like that's the sort of straightforward subjectivist. So then when two people, one of them says murder is wrong, the other one says no, murder is not wrong. That's not a case of moral disagreement, because it's just one of them saying I don't like murder, and the other one saying I do like murder. Right? That's not a case of disagreement. They're just reporting to one another the contents of their own minds. Right? And that doesn't count as disagreement. And the problem with that sort of really stupidly straightforward subjectivism is everything's utterly relative, right? There's no, you can't make any judgments about anything. You just, it's like when we talk about music. So I like Beethoven and you think Beethoven's boring, right? And I express that by saying Beethoven's beautiful, and you express it by saying Beethoven's not beautiful. We don't think that what we're doing is really picking out features of the world. What we're doing is I'm just reporting my feeling and you're reporting yours. I'm not expressing it. Expressivism is slightly different, but I'm just reporting to you what the content of my beliefs are, right? So the problem with that is, and the general kind of reductio of that view is that it makes moral disagreement impossible, right? But moral disagreement seems eminently possible. But anyway, the quasi-realist says, well, not so for me, because when we have a moral disagreement, it's like disagreeing about the interest rate. Okay, it requires human minds to exist. But that doesn't mean that I can, when I say the interest rate is 89 cents to the pound or something, that I'm just reporting my own inner mental state. I'm not doing that. I'm reporting a fact about what we collectively agree upon as being the interest rate. So in that sense, it's subjective because it requires our minds to exist, but it's objective enough for us to sort of forget about that for most practical purposes.
But in that case, everything it would be subjective if it requires our minds to exist, because everything is contingent upon that, right? But would you say that?
The objection, right? Because I was just setting it up.
Yeah. Well, according, for that point of view,
when you get two societies that meet one another that have different intersubjectively agreed moral values, right? So one of them thinks killing race X is good, and the other one thinks killing race X is bad. Now what we've got is that what you want to say about that situation is that one of those cultures is intersubjectively agreeing something to be morally good when it in fact isn't morally good, it's bad. And that you can't, but the intersubjective agreement theory doesn't have the resources to say that. It allowed you to distinguish between the two individual people who meet each other. And you say, okay, that's a poor model for modeling what's going on in moral terms, right? Because it makes it unacceptably relative. And they say, okay, we generalize this to society. Then you can have two societies meet, and then the problem re-emerges at that level.
Okay, but like
off the basic problem and shunting it off to society, and then saying for most practical purposes that works. But because there are these cases where it doesn't work, it seems an unsatisfactory view, right? Whereas the realist has the upper hand there.
But even with moral disagreement, you can still have moral realism, could you not? Moral disagreement is not a feeder of moral realism.
No, moral realism, the kind of cornerstone of moral realism is that it takes moral disagreement seriously.
Yeah, but but again, we're not working with moral realism here. But that's a really interesting objection. The idea of, you know, two societies with different exchange rates meeting. But what I would say is that the analogy wouldn't be that two societies exist who have completely fundamentally different views of like a society coming to another society and saying, no, actually FGM is fine. It's good. It's morally great. Is more analogous to a society coming over who shares our exchange rate and saying that the pound is worth $2. It's not the same as coming over and giving a whole different way to use the exchange rate. Like my moral theory says that the world shares at the base level some basic fact from which we can calculate the exchange rate. And so even if somebody comes over and they say something wildly different, like they think that the pound is $2, I can say, no, you're wrong on that, even though ultimately it's still subjective. So like that base level agreement, which might be the base level agreement might be that I don't know, that $10 or $1 is worth whatever it is. It's about 77p or something. $1 is about 77p, and the whole world shares that very basic agreement. Now you could have really complicated moral discussions. I'd say moral, like in the analogy, you could have really difficult financial discussions. It's like, you know, if I gave this person £5 and they owed me £3, but then the exchange rate we're going to change on this day, and then, you know, how much does this person owe me? Like, yeah, okay, you can have disagreements, and you could say, well, I guess technically, because you've made that link between the basic fact and the top thing, you've made some mathematical error. You think that actually that person's going to owe you $3, and the other person thinks you're going to owe you $3.02. But you can still break it down to that base level and show that one person is wrong, not with reference to an objective fact, but with reference to this subjective base agreement. Now, what I'm saying is that if another society came along, they would still agree with that fundamental base moral agreement. This is what Sam Harris says. Now, my only objection to Sam Harris is saying, well, that base subjective level agreement is subjective, you know, but Sam Harris says, no, it's an objective fact. Pain is pain. It's bad, you know, objectively. But no problem. Like, if we just allow for that disagreement, that basic level subjective agreement is shared globally. So if somebody comes from another culture and says, you know what, actually, I think the pound is worth $2, I can say, no, you're wrong. Not with reference to a fact, but with reference to this subjective base level argument that we both agree with. Let me show you how this surface level financial decision you have made is wrong in accordance to this basic level fact that you agree with. That's my view of morality.
Yeah, well, okay, so I mean, it seems to me that you are an intersubjective. You have an intersubjective view, so kind of quasi-realist view, which would be the best way to characterize that. And I'd probably read someone like Gibbard or someone, if you want to read up on people who hold that view in the literature. But listen, when we're talking about Sam Harris, right, not a thinker I held in particularly high regard, I like to say. I mean, the view that everybody holds to his principle that, you know, that we all have this universal agreement on basic moral principles. It's bollocks, basically. I mean,
no, I do agree with him on that.
It's too bad that that's his view. It's just an implausible starting point. We may just forget about it. I mean, Nazis don't start with the same moral view, and even if they do, there's no reason why everybody should do.
No, but Sam Harris is saying that they do start with that moral they do start with that moral fact, even if they don't realize that they do. Like
that's an article of faith. That's like when a presuppositionist says that you believe in God, even if you don't think that.
No, it's not, because Sam Harris says. I mean, do you disagree with Sam Harris that everybody experiences pain as bad? That's his base level fact.
It might be. I mean, obviously, it's very plausible that everyone assumes that pain is bad. But that doesn't mean that. So there might not be anything of any significance that follows from that. So what you're saying is that not necessarily everyone agrees that pain is bad, right? But let's just say that
no, they do. That's important. They do, because I think the reason why you say not everybody agrees that pain is bad, I think that they actually do, because there are people who enjoy pain, so to speak. But then that's not pain by the definition that I'm going for. But
okay, but let's say that I still think that there's no reason to suppose that very much follows from that, right? Like, if you, and certainly nothing of any, your idea is that if everyone agrees that pain is bad, then you can show that a Nazi is also just being inconsistent by advocating the Holocaust. But that's just not true, right? He says everything's, he says pain is bad. And as another axiom is another one, right? That like people of race Y don't have any moral value, right? So their pain doesn't count, right? And that's not, I mean, your claim is, well, that's logically inconsistent. That's like a presupposition.
Yeah.
Unless you believe in
It's not like
God, you're going to be committed to a contradiction.
It's not like a presuppositionalist, because when a presuppositionalist says that the basic claim is that, you know, you believe that God exists, a person can just say, no, I don't, and they mean that honestly. But with Sam Harris's base point is that you experience pain as bad. You can't say no to that. I mean, that is true. That's demonstrably true.
He takes pain as a common factor.
And so your objection is that you can't necessarily make a link between that and the top level moral.
You're missing the analogy, right? The analogy is here that the Nazi, right, holds, maybe let's just say that he does think that pain is bad, right?
Yeah.
But he also holds that people of race X have no moral value, right? And he holds those two things together. And I just claim there's no contradiction there, right? Pain is bad, but not if you're of race X.
But if you can make a link between saying, well, that view, you know, the view of dehumanizing other people ultimately leads to something which leads to pain for you and everybody,
human suffering.
And it's bad. So yeah, pain and suffering. So it's like, look, the only area of subjective agreement, you don't need to take it all the way down to pain is bad when you're discussing with a person. So if I'm just discussing with a Nazi and we just have to break it down as far as, you know, functioning society is a good thing, that's good enough. So that will suffice for our moral conversation. Now, like you say, there might be another society that then comes along and says, well, actually, we don't think that an orderly society is good. We still, then we break it down and we'll say, well, look, you still agree that pain is bad. Can I make a link between there being an orderly society and the avoidance of pain? If I can, then we should live in an orderly society. I can then make a link between an orderly society and not having a Holocaust.
No, because then they're going to say, look, an orderly society, one by their way of thinking about it, is one that doesn't have race X in it, and that can only be achieved if you kill them.
But they'd have to justify that, and all you'd have to show is that by committing that kind of genocide, it wouldn't lead to an orderly society. They're wrong about that. And now we're in the realm of empirical facts. Now we're in the realm of ISIS. We're in the realm of ISIS now.
Look, if you put yourself in the mind of someone who believes that race is of no moral value and thinks that they're evil or something, then they're just not going to agree that, you know, your an idea of a well-functioning society has any of them in it.
Fine. So then you just break it down further and find this thing that you do agree with.
Okay, so they agree that pain is bad, right? But you disagree with them about whether race X has any moral value.
But also, look, if I'm saying that an orderly society is a good thing, and they're saying that actually, you know, excluding race X is the only way to have an orderly society. Now, I think they're wrong about that. Now, like you say, they might be too stubborn. They might be too arrogant. They're not going to realize that they're not going to concede that they're wrong about that. But it doesn't mean that they are not wrong about that. Like they can be factually in error.
Wait, but you said that there would be an inconsistency in their beliefs. And I'm just saying I don't think that there would necessarily be an inconsistency in their beliefs.
Well, I perhaps in that case, I still think that if you dug down deep enough, you could show an inconsistency between their beliefs. But
that's when it sounds like presuppositionalism, because if you just say, well, look, I believe that God doesn't exist, and you know, I don't think that that's inconsistent, they'll just say, well, sooner or later, if I asked you enough questions, right, you would eventually be committed to two things that were contradictory.
Because the presupposition
is that you just say, actually show it to me, and don't just say that you believe that it's true, right? Because what am I supposed to do with that? Like, you believe it's true. The demonstration of that. So, you know,
the presuppositionalist, their base assumption is something which the opponent to them would not agree with. So that is enough to debunk it with the base moral facts that we're talking about. I'm not talking about me saying something like, well, actually, you know, I think you think that pain is bad, and the other person going, no, I don't. It's like they do. Like there's nobody who would say that they don't. So it's not the same as presupposition.
With the Nazi, again, I've said let's just assume he agrees pain is bad.
Okay.
The with them is over the moral value of the person of race X, right? Pain is bad, but not if it's of this person.
But I can make a link between pain and living in a disorderly society, and I can make a link between a disorderly society and the Holocaust.
But if by disorderly society, he's going to say, to me, a disorderly society is one that's got those stinking race X people running around.
Then I'd say define orderly society, and I'll show you why you're probably wrong about that, or you'll show me why I'm wrong about that.
Orderly society means one that's like a liberal kind of one where everyone's getting along with each other, and he's going to say, "Yeah, I hate that. It's the worst thing ever."
Okay, but then that's not the moral agree. Again, what I'm looking for with the orderly society thing is that point of agreement. If we don't agree on that,
I'm not going to agree with that.
if we don't agree on that, then fine.
Different idea of what orderly society means.
Fine, no problem. You just break it down a bit further. You just go a little bit further.
To what then? To the fact that you agree pain is bad?
Well, it depends.
Society is and whether race.
It depends on the Nazi. It depends on the Nazi. That's what I'm saying. So in my example, I said, well, imagine a Nazi, and we've managed to agree that we both think an orderly society is a good thing, and we mean the same thing by an orderly society. Well, yeah, okay, there could be a situation. Well, maybe they don't agree with that. Well, then you just pick something else. You find something that you subjectively agree with. And if you need, you can break it all the way down, but you usually don't have to.
Let's pick a Nazi who agrees with you that the Holocaust was bad. You'll be able to persuade him that the Holocaust was bad. Okay, what does that doesn't show anything? The point that you're trying to make, I thought, was that everybody can be reasoned into agreement about certain issues, no matter how strange their view is.
I'm not necessarily saying that.
Well, as long as he agrees with me on loads of things, I'll be able to get him to agree with me. The claim, I thought, was that anybody.
No, I'm not saying.
A difficult character for you, and saying, go on and try and persuade this person.
I'm not saying anybody can be convinced, because
you're saying if they do.
It's like
if you had decided that all agreed.
If you can find that subjective agreement, then you can make that link. But there are some people who will think, who will get things wrong. Like they will think that there really is no link between this. And again, because we're in the realm of is here, we can talk about empirical facts. You can show scientifically that certain things are conducive to other certain situations. You can say that situation A brings about situation B. Now that person might disagree with that. They might say, no, you're wrong. Like situation A doesn't bring about situation B. But if they're wrong, then they're wrong.
We're going to have to actually wrap this up. We're gone way over out of time. My producer's going to kill us. But you guys already wrapped this up. We had some great questions, but one last question, just really quick, because I just need to get out of the way. When we're talking about friendship before, I'm on Alex's side. I do think friendship is a moral good, but not a moral obligation. We're not morally obligated to have friends, but it's a morally good thing overall. It's a normative thing. But you're Cosmic. You said that you don't think that is a moral good. So what would be an example for moral good? I'm curious.
Well, as long as you mean like my intuitive sense of moral goodness.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't have to actually hold that position, but
like,
what do you think would be a moral good?
Helping a lady across the street, or driving a person to hospital. Like I don't want to give the impression that I'm disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing. Like most of your moral intuitions I'll share. I just see this specific example of friendship is one that I don't understand why that's a moral good. I understand why that's like it's fun or it's nice or it's I don't see why it's a moral good, but most things that anybody would agree on, like helping a child who's drowning in a swimming pool, that's good. Like I think we agree on most of our moral intuitions. It's just that specific example of friendship. I don't see how that fits the moral.
Would those moral goods be moral facts? I mean, do you accept that moral facts exist? May not be objectively. But
no. Well, it's like, again, you'd have to phrase it like it's an objective fact that I subjectively think that this is good. Like that's as far as it goes.
So if somebody just asks if you have a proposition that is a moral proposition that can be either true or false, you hold there are no moral propositions. Then there are no true moral facts.
Not objectively. Objectively.
Not objectively.
No.
Okay. No. Anyways, we're going to wrap this up. I am going to have an after show. I know you probably knew when you can join because you're obviously in a very different time zone. But anybody in the live chat that wants to join, message me or message Kyle or message the producer, and we will get you in on my channel to kind of talk about some of these things with certain people in the live chat that wanted to suss out, because this was so much to unpack. Honestly, I think you guys just touched the surface of these topics, because you could have gone down 12,000 rabbit holes where we could have probably gone down. And I like I like the fact we finally made it back to meta ethics from normative, but
yeah.
Yes, Kyle. My voice is shot, so if I'm not sounding right, it's because my voice is shot.
Well, I'm gonna let you guys kind of have a few parting words, let everybody know where they can find more of you, your channel, any kind of updates that you want to pass along, and we'll start with Dr. Malpass.
Well, I guess I mean I write a blog. I'm not really big on promoting the stuff that I do. I guess Steve, you can put a link in or something if you want to.
Yeah, promote it. Your blog is great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the description.
Use of reason.
Okay. Cosmic Skeptic.
Yeah, no, I'd say too. Like I have had a look at use of reason as well. I think it's definitely worth promoting. I guess I'd just, well, if you want to find me, I imagine there'll be a link somewhere on this channel or something. But yeah, Cosmic Skeptic everywhere. So twitter.com/, patreon.com/ whatever you like, just Cosmic Skeptic, and that's Skeptic with a K rather than a C, because I'm not American, but a boy can dream. But I just want to say, look, this has been great fun. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I don't think either of us has convinced the other, but I think at least we've elucidated our positions. And you've highlighted a lot of my meta-ethical flaws here that I'm going to have to go and amend. So I'm grateful for the discussion. I've had a good time as well.
You left enough open for a part 2, though. That's the beauty of it.
And I got to say, it's not about convincing somebody. It's about having quality discussion. This is a perfect example of two articulate, intelligent people having a formulated discussion. I mean, I couldn't have asked for anything better. So,
it was very well done. Very well done. And Steve and
it's
I
the hell out of dumpster fire flat earth shit.
Amen. Steve and I want to extend our thanks to both Alex J. O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic, and Dr. Alex Malpass for joining us today. If you guys are part of our Patreon, we, from the show night before last and last night, we have the footage from prior to the show where we tested it out for those 2 shows yesterday and the day before. So we're going to start uploading a thing called Backstage Pass to the Patreon page, where you can actually watch what goes on before and after the show when it closes out. Sometimes the fireworks happen on the other side of the live button. So
it's pretty heated.
Yeah. So we will be putting those 2 things up later today, and then you'll be able to go on there and see the the extra things that we're adding to that. Also, real quickly, September the 5th of 2018, Answers in Genesis. Excuse me. Harvard biologist Nathaniel Jeanson. He is one of the head biologists at the Ark Encounter with Ken Ham. He wrote this book called Replacing Darwinism, and he will be joining us September the 5th to have a debate against Dr. Herman Mays on Replacing Darwin and some of the points that he brought up in that book. So just want to go. It's getting closer to that time. I know we've had it scheduled for a long time, but that will be September the 5th at 8 p.m. So just keep that in mind. And with that, we will see you back here tomorrow for V from Theomachy and talking about Islam and the creation story.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.